Okay, so I guess I'll begin. My name is Steve Goldstein. I'm the interim director of Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, and I'm a professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences here at Columbia. And I'm pleased to welcome everybody to our open house on this rainy day. And I want to thank everybody for actually braving the weather. So this year, characteristic of all our open houses, this is an opportunity to experience our breakthrough science in action. And I want to note that it will be happening until 4 p.m., rain or shine, and there's plenty of shelter around our beautiful campus from the rain. So feel free to please get in touch with your family and your friends and encourage them to come today. Okay? Our Lamont Open House serves several objectives. Okay? One is that we seek to raise the awareness of our visitors about the workings of our dynamic planet. This is an Earth observatory. We seek to raise awareness of the changes we face in our warming climate. We hope to ignite a deep and abiding interest in science. We hope to encourage school-age children and young adults with stories about our natural world, and to plant the idea that a career in earth and environmental sciences can be enjoyable, exciting, and rewarding. Okay? The lecture component is an opportunity to hear directly from a series of top researchers who will describe their work and connect their research with the rest of us. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our Monell Auditorium Lecture Series. I want to note there's another series of lectures through the day in the Gary C. Comer Geochemistry Building that's down the hill in the first floor seminar room. And we have many workshops for students about opportunities for high school students as well as for high school students for internships, as well as bringing research into classrooms. And this takes place in the Geoscience Building, which is near the entrance in the first floor conference room. Okay, so anyway, now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Shaman, who is the interim dean of the Columbia Climate School. Just to give you an overall background about this, Columbia University is composed of 20 schools. 4 of them are undergraduate schools and 16 are graduate schools. And 3 of those schools are the medical school, the business school, the law school. So everybody has heard of these schools. The most recent school that has been formed is the Climate School. Now, the Climate School is the first such school to be formed in the U.S. It was formed in 2020, and its mission is, and this is a quote, to develop and inspire knowledge-based solutions and educate future leaders for just and prosperous societies on a healthy planet. Okay, so a little bit about Jeff, as well as being interim dean of the Climate School. He is professor of environmental health sciences in the Mailman School of Public Health, and he's a professor of climate in the Climate School. He got his undergraduate degree at Penn and his PhD at Columbia. Jeff studies the survival, transmission, and ecology of infectious agents, including the effects of environmental conditions on them. And his work is focused on marine, mosquito-borne, and respiratory pathogens. And one such respiratory pathogen is COVID-19. He uses mathematical and statistical models to describe, understand, and forecast the transmission dynamics of these disease systems and to investigate the broader effects of climate and weather on human health. This is all really exciting stuff. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Jeff and his team at Columbia built one of the first models to project the spread of COVID-19 virus when the disease broke out in China, and his modeling of its spread in the US has been featured on a lot of media outlets. And actually, when he comes up here, Jeff may look familiar as he was on TV quite a lot during COVID-19. And so his title is The Epidemiological Characteristics of COVID-19, Why It Created a Pandemic. Let's welcome Jeff.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me here. Welcome to the open house here at Lamont. I actually did my PhD here at Lamont, and it was in climate science. And just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from on this, a lot of what I started doing was to look at how weather and hydrology and climate affected pathogens and their transmission, as Steve indicated. This led me down a path of actually then trying to investigate them mathematically and model how they would propagate through environments and in populations and move through human populations, as it were. And in doing so, I actually brought and borrowed a lot of techniques from climate and weather forecast and transferred them into systems that describe infectious diseases. And that's really what's led me down this road. And the connection to Lamont has been critical. So, title of my talk is The Epidemiological Characteristics of COVID-19, Why It Created a Pandemic. I'm going to talk about what are those critical features that allowed this virus to be, unfortunately, as successful as it was, why it was a pandemic, whereas some other viruses were not. All right? In order to do this, I have to tell you a little bit about a study that we conducted from 2016 to 2018. So this is a very medical public health study that we led. It was called the Virome of Manhattan. And in it, we had a number of arms of the study, but one of them involved putting together a cohort. The cohort consisted of over 200 individuals. And we asked the individuals to do the following things. Every day, they would get on their phone, and they would enter into it, would go onto a website and automatically enter into a database how they were feeling. We would ask them to rank 9 cold and flu symptoms like cough, runny nose, sneezing, chills, and they would say they had none, mild, moderate, or severe symptoms of that type. And they would enter this every day. It was very simple. It took them only 20, 30 seconds to complete that component of it. And in doing so, we got a daily record of what their symptoms looked like, how they actually felt walking around. We also asked them to tell us whether or not, because of those symptoms, they had taken any cold or flu medicines, whether they had gone to see a doctor, or whether they had stayed home from work or school. And as you can see, we had people from daycares and their parents, people from Columbia University Medical Center who worked there. We had people who worked in pediatric and adult EDs, physicians and nurses and orderlies, and we had high school students and their teachers. So we had a range of individuals in there, but they would tell us whether or not they'd stayed home from work or school, gone to see a doctor, or sought medical care. So we got that on a daily basis. And then every week, regardless of how they felt, we would go and take a nasopharyngeal swab from them. And that's the same type of swab you used when you were COVID tested or when you do that at-home test even now. We would take that back to the lab and we would test it for 18 different common respiratory viruses. So this is before the pandemic, 2016 to 2018. And this table shows you one aspect of some of the results we had. Obviously, we got a lot. It was a very involved study, but you can see the viruses, and they're grouped into species rather than the subtypes. So we don't have influenza A, H3N2, or A, H1N1, or B. It just shows you flu, and it shows you flu, respiratory syncytial virus, parainfluenza, human metapneumovirus, human rhinovirus, adenovirus, and the coronaviruses on the bottom are the wimpy coronaviruses that we've gotten all our life. There are 4 of those. They have these funny alphanumeric names like OC43 and HKU1, but they're very mild. This is not COVID-19 because it's before COVID-19. What you see there are episodes, which is an individual testing positive for 1 or more consecutive weeks for the same virus, while allowing that they may have a negative test in between, just in case there was a poor test result. So you see that we had 32 episodes recorded of influenza infection, 30 of RSV, 275 of rhinovirus, 137 of the endemic coronaviruses. It's very interesting to see that. But I want to draw your attention to the next column, which says MA. That means medical attention. That means that individual told us they went to see the doctor because of the symptoms they experienced at that time. And if you look at the next column, which I've just circled there, it gives you the probability of seeking medical attention given infection with that virus. So if you take MA of 7 for influenza and divide it by 32, you get 0.22, which is 22%, which means that 22% of the time, a person who was infected by the flu actually went to see a doctor, all right? And if you go all the way down to the bottom to coronavirus, it's 4% of the time. What does that tell us? That tells us that people don't go to see the doctor most of the time they get these viruses. Most of the infections we experience are mild enough, some may be asymptomatic, some may be what we call paucisymptomatic, which means weak symptoms. Some might put you in bed, but you don't bother to go see a doctor. Now, why is that important? It's important for a couple reasons. Number one, if you don't go to a doctor, you're not going to be recorded as having had that illness. There's no way that they may test you, and they don't always test you, but there's no way they're going to. We're not going to have any record that you had the flu or RSV or human metapneumovirus unless you go to the doctor. And beyond that, they actually test you for that specific virus, which also happens even more rarely. So the consequence of this is most of these infections are not documented. Now, the other thing that we saw was whether or not people stayed home because of their symptoms. And if you look to the column to the right, which says the probability of staying home, you can see the numbers are pretty low. Flu is the highest. Almost 50% of people at least stayed home. But not everybody did. Less than half did, actually. And they certainly didn't do that the entire time they had the infection and were contagious. All right, so what does that mean? Well, that means that with these viruses, what we do is what you and I would do in the winter before the pandemic when we had a cold or sniffle, when we had a little bit of body aches, if you had a bit of a sore throat. And what would you do? Most of us would do nothing. We'd go to work, we'd send the kids to school, we'd go shopping. If we had a business trip, you'd get on an airplane. If you had a vacation, you'd suck down some Dayquil and you'd get on the airplane. What are you doing? You're taking the virus with you. And are you contagious? Yeah, you're contagious at times. So what is it about this that's really important? Well, these viruses are all common respiratory viruses. The thing that makes them common is that enough of the infections for us are asymptomatic or have weak symptoms, or we become contagious before our symptoms even manifest, that we're going around in the community and taking it with us. We're taking it to new locations. We're exposing people unknowingly. And in doing so, we're helping transmit these viruses and pass them around. So when we saw this, when we did this study, and we were writing up these papers, that was the end of 2019 when this was happening, all right? And we knew that the thing that allowed these viruses to be successful was that so many people didn't seek medical attention and they didn't stay home. So here we go with the pandemic. This virus appears in China in late 2019. This is a map shown from New York Times, nice graphics that they have, showing some schematic of people moving out of Wuhan. We saw in January of 2020, early on, we saw some of these maps that were coming out from public health agencies. And we could see how quickly the virus was translocating from city to city to city within China. And then it was hopping on airplanes, and it appeared in Thailand, and then in Japan, and South Korea, and then the US. And when we looked at that, given what we had seen with those common respiratory viruses, we said to ourselves, this virus is transmitting, and most of the people who have it are not aware. It's producing a lot of mild or asymptomatic infections, and people are going about their business with this virus and taking it around. So we approach these viruses and work with them by building mathematical models to describe them, and that's exactly what we did here. We asked ourselves, how many undocumented infections are there? Are there indeed contagious undocumented people walking around facilitating the spread of this virus? It seems to, just looking at it, how quickly it's getting around. Let's see if we can build a model, interrogate it with data, and see if we can show or estimate how much that is. Stuff on the left are some of the equations of the model. Let me tell you about it with the bullet points on the right. It's what's called a metapopulation model, where we have discrete populations. In this case, each population is a city in China. We had 375 of them. And then we link those cities by travel between them. People move from city to city, a lot of travel. In fact, what we were modeling, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment, well, it's down there on the bottom, we were just simulating a very short period of time, January 10th to January 23rd. And we started doing this about January 17th. We started setting this up, but then they had a lockdown on January 24th, 2020 in China, and they closed movement out of Wuhan. So we just looked at this period before the lockdown. It was the run-up to Chunyun, the Spring Festival in China. It was a lot of movement, but we could use Tencent, which is this cell phone-based data that it plugs into QQ and WeChat or Weibo, I can't remember the name of it in China, these very popular apps that 800 million people are using there. And it would tell us how people are moving. And so we could use that to say, well, how many people are moving from place to place between the cities, the 375 cities that we're representing in our model. Now we couple that model with something called data assimilation methods. And those data assimilation methods are the same thing they use in numerical weather prediction. It's the way they assimilate or suck in or ingest data on satellites, on temperature, precipitation, air pressure, wind patterns. They bring all that information into the model so that the model can better represent reality. Okay? It's called an estimation problem, where they're trying to get the conditions up to right now right, so that when they launch a forecast, they have the model configured so it looks like how conditions are right now. And then you can project it into the future. So we're going to use those same methods, and we're going to couple it. We don't have temperature data here, but we're going to have observations of COVID-19 cases from 375 cities. So again, we're going to simulate from January 10th to 23rd. It's prior to the lockdown, when travel restrictions went in place on the 24th. And in this model, we're separately representing documented, which are those cases, the observed cases that we have, the data that we have, and undocumented infections. We're assuming that only a fraction of the infections are documented in our reported cases. We also had a separate contagiousness for the documented and undocumented infections. So we could see, are they transmitting the virus at the same rate? So before we can do something like this is what's called an inference or estimation problem. We have to test it synthetically. We make an outbreak within the model, knowing what the parameters are, how contagious it is, what percentage of infections are undocumented, how contagious it is from the documented infections versus the undocumented. And then we take the outbreak we generate, we plug it into the model combined with the data assimilation, and see if it can actually estimate those parameters we put in. We do it over and over for different combination of those parameters. And the reason why we want to do it is we want to see if it can estimate those parameters, because those parameters are the critical things. Those are the key epidemiological features of the model. They tell us how transmissible the virus is, how transmissible it is from undocumented people, whether we can actually estimate the fraction of people that are undocumented infections, et cetera. So these plots here show that the blue estimates, which you can see is sort of like a distribution, pretty much line up with the red lines. That in this model, we're able to estimate those parameters. All right? That was a good showing there, which meant then we could apply this to the actual data. We applied it to the actual data, and there are two pieces of information here I want you to focus on. The first one is the reporting rate, alpha. The solution we got was 0.14, and you can see it's got a fairly narrow interval, about from 0.1 to 0.18. That is the estimate of what fraction of all infections are reported cases in China in that 2-week period from January 10th to January 23rd, 2020. And that 0.14 means we're estimating that only 14% of infections had been captured by surveillance and were known to be cases. That means 86% were undocumented. Nobody knew who they were, where they went, how they interacted with the rest of the population. The other one I want you to look at is mu, the second line there, the relative transmission rate. And that tells us the estimate of how transmissible the average undocumented infectious person is relative to somebody who's documented. We figured they may have milder symptoms. Maybe if their symptoms are mild, they're not shedding as much. Maybe that's resulting in less transmission. And we got a number that's actually 0.55, which suggests that the undocumented infections are on average about half as contagious as the documented infections. So we took those numbers and we ran it in the model and saw if it could reproduce the statistics that we observed in the actual data. So this is now taking those parameters and running what's called a free simulation. The X's here are the little asterisks that are in red are observations. On the lower right, it's the number of cities with 10 or more reported cases over time, and each one of those are days. On the left, you're seeing different characteristics, the daily cases in nationally, in Wuhan City, and in Hubei province. And you can see that the blue histograms are the model estimates, 100 realizations of this model, and you can see that they're spanning the observations quite nicely, so they're capturing it. But then what we said is, well, let's do a little experiment here. Right now, we have that the average undocumented infectious person is about half as contagious as a documented infectious person. This is a model. We can change that. Let's make them not contagious at all. We're going to take that mu and we're going to make it 0. So the red shows you what you saw in the last one with the growth of the outbreak nationally in Wuhan, cumulative number of cities with 10 or more cases reported. The blue shows the result when we make it so that undocumented infections cannot transmit the virus. And what we saw was a 79% reduction in cases. So 80% reduction, roughly, in the number of cases observed. All right, so what does this mean contextually, right? Well, at the time we were thinking about it, we said, well, we know of 6 other coronaviruses that are out there that we've encountered as humans. One is SARS-1. This was called SARS-2 very initially. SARS-1 appeared in the late 90s. It's a sub. It was very, very virulent, very dangerous if you got it, but it was very limited in how it went. And what we've seen from serological testing is that there aren't members of the human population who have this who aren't known cases. In other words, there weren't these subclinical cases out there. If we look at MERS, which is the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, that's also a coronavirus. That came out a little later. And what we saw was that there were some asymptomatic cases. Those serological tests suggest that 21% of laboratory identified cases were mild or asymptomatic. So that would have, instead of a 0.14 ascertainment rate, like a 0.8 ascertainment rate. But this virus isn't as transmissible. That was its problem. It couldn't infect enough people from the average infected person. And then we have these seasonal coronaviruses, and there are their funny names. And remember that Viral Manhattan project I showed you, where we had about 135 infection events. 60% of them were mild or asymptomatic, and only 4% of them sought medical care. So the seasonal ones, they're really wimpy. They don't cause much morbidity and almost no mortality. MERS doesn't have a high enough transmission rate to get around. It doesn't pass easily enough from person to person. SARS-1 is very dangerous, but it didn't have any asymptomatic or subclinical infections. There were no undocumented infections. What we're seeing for this here in 2020, in January, when we did this study, was that there are a lot of asymptomatic infections, and unfortunately, at the same time, there is a distribution of morbidity and mortality outcomes. For some people, this virus is very dangerous. And when we looked at it, we said to ourselves, basically, this virus has 3 characteristics that mean it's going to be a pandemic. Number 1, nobody in the human population really has any immunity to it, so it can infect almost everybody. Number 2, the majority of infections are subclinical. People don't know they have it, and they're taking them around with them and bringing them to new communities, taking them to work, school, transmitting them at home, not doing any protective measures. And number 3, even though the vast majority of the infections are mild or subclinical, there are still a lot of people going in the hospital. And even if it has a small infection fatality rate of 0.2%, 0.2% of the entire world's population is a lot of people dying, unfortunately. So we saw this. This is what we concluded with this. And unfortunately, this is indeed what manifests. We took the same model and we applied it to the US. This is just a shot of inter-county commuting. There we go. Inter-county commuting in the United States, typical travel patterns. This is just a time series in 2020 showing cases, confirmed cases in the US, and how they just exponentially took off once we got into March. Those are those same kinds of exercise, now done for every county in the US rather than a city base. So we have 3,142 counties in the United States. And here now we get an estimate for the reporting rate of 0.08. 8% through middle of March were being actually documented, even lower than in China, which is consistent with the limited testing capacity that we had in the US at the time. And at the same time, the relative transmission rate roughly the same, 0.64, 64% rather than 55%. So our model, just to show you, it was on the front page of the New York Times. This was March 20th, where we projected how it might move across the country. Without control, we were expecting really rapid saturation, without any response actions, without any shutdowns by July 1. Some control measures are shown here. Severe control measures and travel restrictions were shown here. We wound up taking this pathway, well, more this pathway, I would say, in some sense. People masked up. There was a lot of fear, obviously, at that time as well. We've used these kinds of methods to do other analyses since then, one of which was we could take it to fit the first wave of the outbreak. This is showing you national cases and national deaths. The red dots are the observations, the actual reported numbers, and this is the model fitting to it. Same kind of model. This is for the New York metropolitan area. And these right here, that's estimates of the transmissibility. You might have heard of that R number all the time during the pandemic. And the transmissibility of the virus, you see it starts high and it goes low. Well, these are the control measures coming into effect. That's the lockdown in San Francisco, the shutting of restaurants in New York City, the closing of schools, keeping people away. The manifestation of it was that we could estimate that the virus wasn't transmitting from person to person as quickly. And so what we could do with this is we could actually do an exercise where we said, well, what if we moved back that RE estimate 1 week? So we assumed that society did exactly what it did. Over in North Dakota, they did nothing. In San Francisco, they did a lockdown. In Louisiana, they took some measures. But we're going to move it a week forward. We're going to take those transmissibilities and move them a week earlier. And that's what you're seeing in the top plot. It's showing you the observations that we were fitting before here. Remember, we fit them right here. And now we're saying, all right, if we had done exactly what we did in terms of control, but just 1 week earlier, well, we're really bringing the curve down. You can see that it's reduced. And if we did it 2 weeks earlier, cases, deaths, over 90% reduction. Now, that's not something we could have held on to. But there are some countries around the world that managed to control this. Places like Thailand and Vietnam and South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, they did very well controlling the virus. And that was really the name of the game that we had hoped for. You want to control the virus without completely disrupting the economy and give society time to develop a vaccine that's effective. We did develop some effective vaccines, and those countries greatly benefited because they were able to vaccinate the vast majority of their populations before they were ever infected. And they had much lower mortality rates as a result. So, just want to show you a couple other things, and then I'll stop and take a couple of questions. This is that ascertainment rate, the fraction of people who were documented cases, and just showing you it over time. Very low early on in March, and then as it climbs up, you can see it rises up to about a quarter of all infections being reported by the end of 2020. Same for New York, roughly. And one other thing that we estimated during 2020 is, well, how many people had been infected in the US? And you see here, this is the susceptibility here. And by the end of the year, we were estimating about only a third of the population had been infected. But that's a lot more than the number of reported cases. All right, I will stop there, show you a little bit about what we've been able to do with our model inference systems, and I'm happy to take some questions.
What are your thoughts on ivermectin? And
Ivermectin?
And would it have saved many lives?
So, it's not my area of specialization. I read up on it for some time. So ivermectin is used to get rid of worms. It's very effective against onchocerciasis. And there were some initial laboratory studies that suggested it might be very effective against this virus. It really killed it in laboratory environments, including cellular environments. The tests that have been done with humans that I have seen thus far do not show it to be particularly effective though. So it wasn't brought out as something to be used. What they often did with COVID-19, when there is such a need and an urgency to act on things, is they'll take things off the shelf and try them off-label, which is what it is. So we have all these existing agents and chemicals and biopharmaceuticals. Maybe they'll have some actually pharmacokinetic activity against a particular pathogen. The evidence wasn't strong enough for ivermectin to make it use. But on the other hand, there were rapid developments of monoclonal antibody therapies that are effective, and they have been deployed quite a bit. They have to keep changing them to get ahead of the changing variants, but they are quite effective. And now, of course, we have Paxlovid as well. Yes?
Really fascinating talk. I have a question about and I don't know if your model incorporated it. When the shutdown was about to happen, especially in Europe, there was this huge exodus where it was announced that people were not going to be able to come back to the US or travel. And so you did have this massive redistribution of people who were probably already affected. So was that incorporated into your model? How does that affect modeling in the future for situations like that?
So there are models that are built by just a couple of groups where they try to use plane travel and try to incorporate that in. It's a very tricky proposition because the data are hard to get in real time, and they're very limited, and they charge a lot of money. They privatize that. That exodus, no matter how large you're saying it, is very small, however, relative to the population of the United States, right? And one of the questions, of course, is introduction. Once the virus is in a location, how are the dynamics of transmission controlled? Is it because people are importing it in who are contagious, or is it because there's transmission happening locally that's actually driving it? And the answer is the latter, really, for the most part. The way we handle it in our model with that importation is that we're constantly seeding it, but because it's assimilating data, it's following the data. If some of those people who come in are contagious or have the virus, and a portion of them will wind up in the hospital, right? That same 8 to 14% of them. That signal is going to be picked up by the model through the data, and it's adjusting it accordingly. But we didn't explicitly handle that importation, but we could handle it implicitly, as I said. Yes.
Thank you. I'm curious what your model suggests about mask wearing. I've heard various different things kind of in hindsight about mask wearing. What does your model suggest?
This model doesn't really suggest anything about it, but we've done some studies on it since then. And as a matter of fact, a colleague of mine, Dr. Wan Yang, and I have a paper in review that looks at the efficacy versus the effectiveness. And she did also a study in 2020 to see how effective masks were in New York City. And she found that they did have a contribution. It was small relative to the lockdowns and the limiting of mass gatherings, but they were effective. What we found in the more recent study is that, you may have heard about these, randomized trials and how they show that things are not as effective as we hoped they were, but when you test them in the lab, they have what's called a high efficacy. So there's a difference between efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is in ideal conditions, how well a mask might work, and of course that's still going to vary depending on the quality of the mask and how well it actually filters things out. The effectiveness is the real world activity, where people don't wear the masks all the time, they take it off at home, in the household, et cetera. And what we can see from that is that when people are living in their families and they go home and they have meals together, they're not wearing their masks and they're not putting them all on all the time. The effectiveness drops off tremendously. So that disconnect between what you see in a lab and what we see in the real world actually makes a lot of sense because we're not wearing them all the time. And I hate to say it, a lot of transmission takes place in the home. That's a big place where these viruses are transmitted. It's where we have the most intimate contact with people. It's where we share meals with people and we're around them all the time. That facilitates the transmission of these viruses. And anybody of you who know, having young kids, kid brings it home from daycare, it goes through everybody in the household, okay? The same thing goes on here. And we're not wearing masks in the household. That's the problem. We got a couple other questions here. I don't know who has the mic.
Have they ever determined the origin of the COVID-19, the lab in Wuhan versus the wet market in Wuhan?
They have not, and I don't think we ever will. The reality is that the Chinese government was not forthcoming with information about what was happening there. They have not allowed the kind of investigation that would really perhaps help settle the matter. But be that as it may, it's really hard to know what happened. And unfortunately, both are really possible. There have been papers, they're all inferential, that suggest, there really are some natural reservoirs for it. But, there was a lab in Wuhan City that was conducting experiments on coronaviruses. They were doing something called gain-of-function experiments there. Those are experiments where you pass the virus through and you're trying to engender qualities like greater transmissibility or greater virulence. And you do that so you can study them. It's not to be nefarious or malicious, so that you can study it and actually figure out what are the mechanisms so we can better control it. I personally think that those kinds of experiments should not be done, but we live in a world where they are done. And so, unfortunately, you cannot discount the lab leak theory, but you cannot discount a natural origin theory either. And we do not have enough evidence, and even if the Chinese government were completely transparent about it, I still don't know if we'd have enough evidence to actually settle this debate. One more question we're allowed.
Unfortunately, I couldn't get here in time, but I wanted to know if you addressed the PCR test at all.
What do you mean the PCR? In what way?
Its validity, because the person who designed it said it was not supposed to be used for diagnostics.
I think, all the tests, including the home tests that we have, I never heard about this not being used for diagnostics. Oh, Carrie Mullis. Yeah, Carrie Mullis is not the most reliable source for many, many things. For one thing, we're here, I'm the dean of the climate school, he's a climate change denier. He needs to, I would just say bluntly, stay in his lane. He had a brilliant idea. One of the most brilliant inventions of the 20th century was the polymerase chain reaction. And it is phenomenal. But beyond that, I don't think he has a lot of credibility talking about a lot of other things. Got to be blunt.
Actually, I'd like to ask one question before you leave. So, what was it that South Korea and Thailand and these countries that were very successful, what was it that they did that we didn't do that made them so successful?
That is a great question, and they did different things, which is interesting. They didn't have any special sauce and anything that made it instantly amazing. South Korea, actually, because of what had happened both with Ebola and with MERS had actually affected South Korea, had put legislation on the books where they could quarantine people and require they be quarantined, and where they were allowed to go into their phone and credit card records to see where they've been. And so they were, when somebody tested positive, able to go into those records, see where they'd gone, what restaurants, shops, and then put those people in isolation, test them, and only release them out. Those are measures we couldn't do here. Vietnam, I'm not as clear on. They were even more effective, and they just used some ring ideas where they would isolate areas where it felt, and they would just ring them off and keep it down, and they used basic public health measures. Some of the Other places like Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan have a clear advantage being island nations where they could really control the point of entry. And it gets back to your question from before. You know, if you can stop it from coming in after you've controlled it, so you've suppressed it using control measures, distancing, et cetera, and then you can prevent it from being reintroduced, you can keep things safe for a time. And they were able to do that. So it varied by country. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. The next lecture in this, or the next event in this room is at noon, so it's in 15 minutes.
And I noticed, sorry.
Hi, folks. I'm just here to tell you that there's going to be a little delay in the start of the next thing because some of the people have been delayed in getting here, so we're expecting it to start in about 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Okay. So we'll be back in a bit. All right, I'm told that we're going to juggle a few things and get underway here, okay? So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the next event. My name again is Jeff Shaman. I'm the Interim Dean of the Columbia Climate School, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to Open House and this panel discussion. The panel discussion today offers the opportunity to bring conversations about climate justice to this open house. It's going to be bridging hard science and climate justice because it's paramount to properly move forward and achieve an equitable and empowering transition that addresses the impact of climate change on marginalized communities. This is going to be a fireside chat, and it stems from an ongoing collaboration sponsored by Columbia's Provost and Executive Vice President offices. This is something that's going to be led by our moderator, Marco Tedesco, that attempts to leverage the ground for the formation, growth, and sustainment of a Columbia Environmental and Climate Justice Center. It's a unique and crucial opportunity that will build the necessary bridges among different communities and create a new vocabulary that will allow improved communication and action. To hear more about this is what our panel is about, and we hope this will be the first of many climate justice activities that you'll see here in Lamont at the future. So I'm now going to introduce Marco Tedesco. He's a Lamont Research Professor and a moderator of this exceptional panel.
Thanks, Jeff. I just going to spend a few words, and I'm going to then sit on the side. I've been involved with this group led by Paul Gallet and Jackie Klopp originally, and now with Sheila Foster and Camila Puna and other people to spearhead a little bit of activities on climate justice at Columbia University. How do we get organized? What are our strengths and weaknesses? And how do we work together within and outside Columbia walls to build a more resilient community. My specialty in this area is going to look at data, ethics, and climate justice. There are people who know better than I do. I've been starting to support the climate justice work about 6-7 years ago, transitioning from hard sciences and hearing the call. And I do invite everybody in this room and outside to do the same. It's a very educational and empowering experience. So please do not hesitate, don't feel shy to say, well, how can I contribute? Or I made mistakes in the past, or that's all stuff that can be fixed. And to speak about climate justice, we have Skylar Walkers, who she's going to actually join remotely because she's at a conference, but she kindly agreed to speak with us, and she's the Associate Dean at Columbia for Diversity Inclusion, and I'm pretty sure I'm missing a lot of the terms, and Skylar, she will talk to us. So let's hear from Skylar, and I'll introduce then the remaining two panelists. Thank you so much for being here. Skylar, we cannot hear you. 1 second. Phil? I think the volume was low. Can you try it again? We're working on it. Just give us a second.
No problem.
Try again, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so very much, Marco. And welcome, everyone. So excited and thrilled to have you present at the Columbia Climate School Open House. It's a really, really, really beautiful day here in New Orleans. So I'm hoping that you're getting sunshine and beautiful weather to welcome you to our Lamont campus as well. I'm really excited to be here and really wanted to share with you space and engage in a conversation about the critical importance of this work. One of the things that I'm consistently inspired by and have for all of my life, professionally and vocationally, is the spirit of youth. The spirit of youth in the sense that I believe that learners with curiosity and inquiring minds really are going to be the place and the space that advance transformation for our world. And as an educator, I have the very, very wonderful luxury of being in the midst of that inquisitive kind of nexus of learning in the K-20 space. So allow me to kind of reintroduce myself, and thank you again, Marco, for that gracious introduction. My name is Dr. Skylar Walks, and I have the pleasure of serving as the inaugural Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Anti-Bias. So most of you have heard those terms before, or DEI or DEIA, but I'd like to challenge you respectfully and with love to extend the way that we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-bias to also include some other terms. I'd like to challenge you to also be very conscientious to include anti-racism, accessibility, and justice in those terms. If you could make sure that you extend your thinking to not only include diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-bias, but diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-bias, anti-racism, accessibility, and justice, it would be a challenge that I think can move mountains. And the reason why I'm encouraging you to expand these terms is because when we think very conscientiously about structures, systemic structures and institutions that have historically impacted access, then we're being very intentional in naming our desire to transform work that will advance change, right? So when we think about anti-bias and we think about anti-racism and we think about including accessibility into the conversation with the overarching umbrella of justice, we are very clear on our assignment. And one of the things that I'd like to again mention and bring into the conversation is who often tends to be very clear about their assignment are our younger learners. And with that, I'd like to again focus on the ways in which we reconsider and reconstruct our philosophy around education. I've had a very unique professional experience as an educator. I've essentially taught every grade from pre-K or pre-kindergarten through older adults, literally. So that means I'm not only a K-12 educator, so that I've taught in primary and secondary institutional spaces, But I've also taught and continue to teach in the post-secondary or higher education space, working with graduate students and even adult learners. And one of the things that I've noticed is there are far more connections than there are differences. More often than not, we tend to think of K-12 as one space with primary and secondary education, and then we think of post-secondary education as another space. But I can tell you, as a scholar and a practitioner in this work, one of the gifts of education is that we have far more in common than we have apart. And so, with that, when we think about the ways in which we can tackle climate change and climate justice, I can assure you that the luxury of curiosity is not something that we have to lose as younger learners. It's something that we should continue, not only in our primary grades and our secondary educational spaces, but well into our post-secondary institutional spaces and learning environments as adult learners. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how this connects to our conversation today, because diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-bias, anti-racism, accessibility, and justice can feel a little overwhelming, but I hope to distill it in a way, right, to bring it together in a way that's more accessible. So with that, I want to ask you, what is your opinion about the value of curiosity? And I know I'm via Zoom here, so it's a little awkward, but I want to be in conversation with you. So if there's a way to hear from the audience, I'd love to hear from you. What do you place as the value on curiosity? Can I hear from anyone in the audience?
I'm just asking the people to either scream or get the mic. Who wants
Oh,
to
thank you. No worries, no rush. It gives us time to think.
raise your hand? Don't be shy. This is the open house.
This is a judge-free zone.
Yes.
It's not a quiz. I promise you, you won't be assessed on your performance around this question.
We have a
It's
person.
just a conversation.
I think curiosity is something, it's a big motivator, I think. When you're curious about something, you're more interested in it, and it drives you to pursue whatever you want. It's like the big motivator, I think.
I love that. It's a motivator, it's a driver. Great. Anyone else? Thank you for that contribution.
Just 1 second.
Hi. I think curiosity allows us to step out of our box of what we already know and see what we don't know. So it puts us in that space of, I know that I don't know, so I'm going to look, into other possibilities, and that can take us to new pathways.
I love that. So what I heard you say, if you'll allow me to kind of recapitulate it, is that curiosity can take us from a place or a space of not knowing to knowing, or at least exploring the pathway of knowing. Thank you for that. Anyone else?
Curiosity was the way that everything started from so I guess it's like the building bricks for everything.
I love it. It's the cornerstone or the bricks that build everything. Anyone else? Great contributions.
I think curiosity, it's basically the bedrock of education, in my opinion. As a student currently, it what motivates me to keep going and to ask questions about what I'm learning about, like in social studies class or AP World History. If you're interested in what you're learning, you're more likely to pursue it further. You're more likely to ask questions, to inquire, to seek other opportunities to learn more about it. So I think without curiosity, education wouldn't be as important as it really is.
Fantastic. I love that. Can I borrow that? Curiosity is the bedrock of education. I mean, the synergy is so clear, I think, among the discussion points that you've each brought up. You've got curiosity as a motivator, a driver, a pathway to get us from what we don't know to what we do know, the bedrock of education. It's essentially something that advances our opportunity to ask questions and problem solve. And I want to reiterate and emphasize that every single one of those definitions surrounding the value of curiosity is on point. Anyone else?
Hey, hello, Dr. Box. Himanshu this side. Yeah, so
Hi, Himanshu.
hi, how are you? So my
Great.
perception is like my definition would be to know curiosity would be to know about other people's perception and from where they have come, what point they put forward, and what's the reason behind that. So curiosity towards that, to knowing what's the other people's point of view. Thank you.
Excellent. I appreciate the way you brought in the humanistic perspective of being curious about one another, being curious about varying perspectives, being curious about the diversity of communities that we engage. And oftentimes we think that when we're parts of community or a part of a community, that we already have kind of a homogeneous philosophy or anchor, right? But that's not always true. Even when we're in an affinity community or a community that appears to be homogenous, maybe we're studying the same thing, maybe we have similar interests. To your point, Himanshu, we can always be curious and ask questions, just like the other person shared, in a way that helps us move from a space and place of not knowing to knowing, or at least better understanding one another. And that really is the nucleus of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-bias, anti-racism, accessibility, and justice work. It's also valuing all of those differences and all of those various perspectives in an equitable way. It also means that we don't stop being curious. So I'd like to extend this a little bit further, and I'd like to remind you that curiosity is actually your superpower. I'm going to say that again. Curiosity is actually your superpower. And you don't have to be linear in the way that you think about solving problems, or the way that you think about pathways to discovery, or the way that you think about exploring questions. It doesn't have to be linear. As you know, the acronym STEAM, how many of you are familiar with the acronym STEAM? Many of us have heard of STEM, but does anyone know STEAM? STEAM? I just realized, by the way, that the captions aren't on. If someone could please turn on the captions, because when we talk about accessibility, we always want to be good practitioners, right, of accessibility. So I'm going to take a moment and ask if we could just please activate the captions. Can everyone?
We're working on this, Skylar. We're looking for the technician. Thank you.
Take your time, please. And this is a great opportunity for us to learn as a community. So when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-bias, anti-racism, accessibility, and justice, one of the things that we have to commit to is not only understanding them as critical entry points for effective engagement and conversation that drives inquiry and problem solving, but we also have to make sure that we are really modeling a level of consciousness where we're being as inclusive as possible. So in the hybrid world or in the virtual world, I want to challenge each of you that whenever you're on a Zoom call or whenever you're in a room presenting and you have a screen behind you, to always activate captions. The transcription really does help. And we're not only talking about ability and disability, because certainly it helps with respect to disability and, individuals who may be hard of hearing or deaf, but it also helps with individuals where English might not be their first language. It also helps, even quite frankly, in terms of dialect and accent, which are all beautifully diverse things that many of us have as a part of our identity, but they're not always well translated in audio without the support of captions. It looks like they're there. Perfect. The captions are showing up. Can everyone see them in the room?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So with that, I said before, curiosity is a superpower, and I was linking that to STEAM. So I'm imagining we've heard of STEM, right? We've heard of STEM, right? I'm imagining that's a yes.
Yes.
Okay, STEAM is a little bit different. The difference is the A, and the A stands for the arts. And one of the things that I'd love to encourage is as we move forward with our curiosity and we make sure that that curiosity is the bedrock of our learning experiences and engagement, particularly engagement that aims to be as inclusive and equitable as possible and as anti-bias as possible and as anti-racist as possible and as just as possible, that we also appreciate the unique gifts that the arts can contribute to our learning process. One of the things that we know, and scholarship reinforces this, is that STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, are literally augmented, right? Our ability to conceptualize, our metacognitive processes are augmented, literally augmented, when we also bring in the arts. So when we talk about STEAM, that's essentially what we're doing. We're making sure that we honor exploration and curiosity as drivers through the arts, in addition to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Because as such, this speaks to the very uniquely diverse, holistic development of learners in education. And remember, education is not limited strictly to institutional and formal settings. They happen in non-formal and informal settings as well, in our communities, when we're alone, when we're in groups, when we're in pairs. So as we think about the ways in which we can drive and arrive at curiosity and arrive at answers to our questions, where curiosity is that pathway and the bedrock of our learning, I want us to be mindful not only of the acronym diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-bias, anti-racism, accessibility, and justice, but I also want us to be very conscious of mind about being inclusive of the A in STEM. So we're now talking about STEAM. Really quickly, I'm going to transition over to a little bit of a summary about how we can move this forward, because I introduced my passion in working with K-20 communities. You may remember I said in the beginning that K-12 is often thought of one entity, right? Primary and secondary education, and then post-secondary education or higher education. And I use the term post-secondary education. I don't use the term higher education because higher education tends to imply that there's a lower education, and I don't believe that. And it also doesn't acknowledge that there are many people who are talented and intellectually gifted and more than capable of contributing to spaces of higher learning, but may not have had access. And we know that to be historically true. So when we think about K-12 and post-secondary education, I want us to start thinking about them not as K-12 and post-secondary, but as K-20. So what does that mean? That means in an effort to advance learning and to encourage learners to keep that curiosity as the bedrock, which was mentioned previously, we need to start younger. We need to start helping to massage the minds and the curiosity of our younger learners around climate change and climate justice in a way that drives that curiosity, to help them explore and create more questions, right? And one of the things that we did at the Columbia Climate School in the unit of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-bias, anti-racism, accessibility, and justice is we did something called a book basket drop-off. So essentially, we sent a letter that invited 32 schools across New York City that were K-12 schools to participate in a book basket giveaway, which meant that there was no expectation of anything from the schools in the K-12 realm across New York City. But we wanted to share 14 climate change books at various grade levels and reading levels with learners so that they could have a book basket that would then in turn become a library in their home. So essentially, out of those 32 schools, there were roughly, I think there were 9 that agreed to participate, right, in this exercise. And I'd like to honor those schools. PS 59, okay, MS 247, PS 971, which is also an official partner of the Columbia Climate School. So I'd like to acknowledge Principal Ruth, Dr. Ruth, okay. Also IS X 318, the School of Mathematics, the Bronx School of Law, ISX 303, Leadership and Community Service, Bayside High School, and Irvin Altman Middle School 171. So these schools partnered with us, meaning the Columbia Climate School, and agreed to receive book baskets for their learners, for sibling sets within the school, so that those students could essentially take home roughly 14 books that had climate change titles across various reading levels. And I want to ask you, why do you think this was an important initiative? And these schools, just so you know, are located in Queens, the Bronx, Manhattan, and Brooklyn. Staten Island, we love you. We'll get to you this year. But there was a reason why we were intentional about creating partnerships with schools across 4 of the 5 boroughs. Why do you think that was important, particularly in K-12 when we're a university? Why would it matter?
There is a one end question here. Maybe after this question, we can slightly move to the next answer. We can move to the next, and we can reconvene later. But there's a person here who wants to give you an answer.
Yes.
To answer your question, I think it's a great motivator to inform students about certain topics, specifically climate change, at a younger age, so that we can avoid the ignorance at a later state in their point in life.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. When they're equipped with, again, the curiosity and tools to help them explore solutions, then they can activate around those questions, right? And seeking solutions. Thank you for sharing that. So with that, I'm going to transition now. I think as Marco shared, we'll be transitioning now into the panel, but I hope this was a conversation that helped you learn a little bit more about the importance of building not just K-12 and post-secondary ed separate or disparate partnerships, or seeing them as separate entities, but really viewing them as a confluence of holistic learning opportunities, as one entity that's along a longer trajectory, so learners can have access to equitable resources and are essentially mentored and given more opportunities to explore as and with the curiosity as a driver, issues around climate justice and climate change. But doing that by making paramount the acronym that we reviewed earlier today, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-bias, anti-racism, accessibility, and the most overarching one, justice. Thank you for allowing me to be with you today. Thank you for allowing me to hold space with you. And I look forward to connecting with you in person. So if you ever want to set up a meeting, have a conversation, please do know that you can reach out anytime. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Skylar. And now we have Christine Douglas, who will introduce herself for the sake of time, and we can have a... Yeah, in the meantime, we're saving time.
Can we move the chairs just for a minute, because I'm going to use this for something else.
Okay, we'll take care of the chairs. Don't worry. Thank you, guys.
Yeah! Yo, yo, viva Bahia, ora meu Deus, terra boa, adorada, terra rica de grandeza, onde Deus fiz a morada, onde tem o cálice bento, iaiai, a oxa consagrada, onde nasceu a capoeira e ainda luta camarada. E é viva meu Deus, e é viva meu Deus, camarada. E é viva meu mestre, e é viva meu mestre, camarada. E é quem me ensinou, e é quem me ensinou, camarada. That was a ladainha, an homage to Bahia, Salvador, in Brazil. I'm a capoeirista. I'm also an archaeologist, a climate scientist, and I see all of these things coming together and working together to
advance ideals of justice, interdisciplinary collaboration in science, and just health and well-being for us, for communities around the world, for the environment. So what I'm going to do today, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to ask a few people here to be brave and come to the front. Just a couple of volunteers. Somebody who feels comfortable moving a little bit. Everybody's going to move, so don't think that just because you're sitting, you're not going to move. But I want a couple people up front if you can. Let's say like 3, 4 people. Come, don't be shy.
Don't be shy, guys. Come.
Just come. Just come. Come. Vem. So I'm going to teach you, I sang you a ladainha, which is the way in capoeira we open the roda, the game that we play. Raise your hand if you've heard the term capoeira before. Okay, a lot of people have heard capoeira. Who has done capoeira before? Oh, so why aren't you here? No, come. If you just raised your hand because you've done capoeira before, come here. Okay, so capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian martial art that was developed by African and Afro-descended peoples in Brazil during and after the transatlantic trade. Capoeira is richly and closely tied to many other art forms, including maculelê, samba, many different forms of samba and other kinds of martial arts that live in Brazil. Capoeira is probably the most well-known, but it comes from a tradition, many traditions actually, on the African continent of martial arts, but that are tied very intimately to music and to the arts. So Skylar just talked about the importance of the arts, in STEAM and helping us to understand, our humanity, in essence, as we tackle scientific questions. But so capoeira brings together all of these things. And to be very quick today with the time that we have, I just want to make a couple of points about how I see capoeira helping us as scientists, as members of the global community, to advance ideals of justice and to ensure that the science that we practice is rooted in justice and community concerns, and also is very much connected to the challenges we face and to the environment and to staying connected to the environment. So for one thing, capoeira, everybody come here. Capoeira is practiced as a martial art, but is hidden and disguised as a dance and as a game. There's a reason for that historically. It was illegal for African and Afro-descended peoples to practice a martial art in Brazil. Illegal to train fighting for obvious reasons. People developed these practices to hide martial arts movements in sort of dance or acrobatic movements even, and to make it look like a game. So when we say capoeira, we say we are playing capoeira. There's a very important historical reason for that. Okay. So it's played as this game, but the ethos, the philosophy that capoeira was born from is one in which you don't hit something head on. Right? All capoeira movements are grounded, first of all, so you're gonna do this behind me, in what we call the Jenga. So everybody behind me is gonna do this. So put your left foot forward and your right arm forward. And then we're gonna step to the side and we're gonna bring our left arm forward and our right foot forward, okay? So this Jenga movement is a kind of swing movement that we practice in capoeira that ties all of the other movements together. So when you are gonna do a kick, when you're gonna do an escape movement, it's always connected to all these other movements through the Jenga. The Jenga philosophically is about moving through things, moving around things, not hitting things head on, right? How can we, for example, learn to collaborate better as scientists who need to leverage chemistry, archaeology, all of the different fields that we have at our disposal? We need to be able to tie them together effectively. How can we do that? Well, we can learn to move together better. We can learn to be more flexible in our minds, to understand that somebody may be coming to the table with theories and methods in one field that might be able to be integrated into another field. This is not just an intellectual exercise. This is an exercise about learning to communicate with people, learning to move with people. Everybody's moving, everybody's doing the Jenga, vai, Jenga, okay? So when we, as capoeiristas, are practicing ginga, it's not just the physical movements that we're doing in the game. It prepares us for how we interact in life with other people. Every time I walk through Grand Central or Times Square, 42nd Street, and there's all these people walking around, and it's just crazy, I'm always thinking, as a capoeirista, how can I ginga around people? How can I not bump into somebody, but also stay connected to people, you know, make eye contact with people. That's really important. So that's the first movement, okay? So the second movement that we're gonna just demonstrate here is a very simple kick. So there are attacks and defenses in capoeira. So we're gonna do this one where we bring our leg from the outside inside. It's called meia lua de frente. Everybody say, meia lua de frente. Let's hear it. Just means a half moon, a forward half moon. So meia lua de frente is like this. Okay, and we go back to our ginga, and we'll do it on the other side. Meia lua de frente. Everybody doing it? Nice. Ginga, ginga, ginga. Nice. Meia lua de frente going this side. Okay, so this is an attack move, right? You can kick somebody, and my son, who is 8 and was comparing notes with his friend, Meia Lua, who does taekwondo. My son does capoeira. He was like, is capoeira better than taekwondo? Like, am I gonna be, you know, a better, you know, whatever, martial artist? I said, you know, in all of the MMA, crazy MMA viral videos, it's always a capoeira movement that does the crazy knockout. Okay, so that's meia lua de frente. So to respond to that, we have many forms of escape and defense. So we're gonna learn one defense that's called cocorinha. So we're gonna come down like this, arm up to protect ourselves, and we'll come back up. So that's cocorinha. So if somebody does, can I have a volunteer here? You're looking at me, so I know you want to do it. Okay, so face me. You're gonna face me. Face me this way. There we go. So we're in our ginga together, like that. Good. So you're gonna do that kick that we just practiced, okay? And I'm gonna defend by going into cocorinha. Ready? Go ahead, anytime. Okay, so she just kicked me, and so I come down into cocorinha like this. Let's do it one more time. Yeah, it's fine, it's fine. I'll follow you. Go ahead. Okay, so you kick this side now. Bye. Nice. Okay, give her a hand, everybody. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so we just learned 3 capoeira movements. We learned ginga. Everybody say ginga. We learned meia lua de frente, and we learned cocorinha. Cocorinha. So with those 3 movements, all of you can already play a capoeira game. And what I mean by that is that all of you can take that principle of not hitting something head on, moving, flowing, trying to connect with other people, watching their body movement, their body language, getting to know them, and then trying to translate that into how you interact with people outside of a capoeira circle, how you interact with other scientists, how are you going to, in a debate, let's say, about climate change that is contentious, which many of us have been in these kinds of conversations, especially in recent years, a contentious conversation, how are you going to show up in that conversation in a way that promotes dialogue? Because we need to be talking to one another. You know, these are difficult issues. As an archaeologist, I feel I have a responsibility to communities in the locations where I do research to make sure that the questions that we're asking and the way that we are trying to address those questions really centers community concerns and has some kind of positive outcome for those communities. How can I show up in that space? I bring the philosophy, the practice of capoeira with me. So because we're very short on time, you all are gonna help me. We're gonna sing, we're gonna lead one very, very, very short song, and you all have to respond also, okay? So the words are very simple. What you're gonna sing is, oh, sim, sim, sim. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Oh, sim, sim, sim. Everybody say that? Sim, sim, sim. And you're gonna sing the loudest. Oi, não, não, não. It just means, oh, yes, 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 no, 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 okay? What does that mean to you? Why would there be, you know, does that make sense in a song to say yes, 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 no, no, no? What could that mean to you? Any ideas?
Anybody here?
It could be like if you're like divided on an issue, like, or a bunch of people who can't agree on what to do in a situation.
Yeah, I like that. Absolutely. Yes. Another idea? That's awesome. I like that. It can mean a lot of things. And that's part of the beauty of the song. Okay, I'll tell you the other words that I'm going to sing. You're just going to respond very quickly. I'm going to sing Hoje tem, amanhã não. Today we have, or you have. Tomorrow, no. Hoje tem, amanhã não. Oi, sim, sim, sim. Oi, não, não, não. Okay, so the melody is like this. Oi, sim, sim, sim. Oi, não, não, não. Everybody. Oh, sim, sim, sim. Oi, não, não, não. Hoje tem, amanhã não. Hoje tem, amanhã não. Oh, sim, sim, sim. Loud. Oi, não, não, não. Hoje tem, amanhã não. Hoje tem, amanhã não. Oh, sim, sim, sim. I know you can sing louder than that. Oi, não, não, não. Oi, sim, sim, sim. Oi, não, não, não. Okay, good. So I think there's a lot of messages we can take away from that song. You all can go have a seat. Give him a hand, please.
Thank you, guys.
A lot of messages, but you know, one is the urgency of what we're facing right now with climate change and the impacts it's having, particularly on communities who are on the front lines, who have been marginalized or under-resourced. So let's think about that too. You know, they're thinking today we have, tomorrow we don't. We should also be thinking along those lines, because although we are buffered in many ways and very privileged in dealing with the impacts of climate change, you know, we have a responsibility, and arguably a greater responsibility, to show up to make sure that the way that we address the climate crisis is just. So that was a very quick, like, entrance into Capoeira world. I hope everybody seeks out arts like Capoeira. It's not the only art form that has this connection to the environment historically and to justice movements, but it is one, and it's a very powerful one. Thanks for participating.
Thank you, Christina. So at this point, we're being very flexible time. I hope you're enjoying the session. I want to introduce you. I want to go back, close the loop to somebody whom I met recently, and she's basically, we overlap so much in terms of what we want to do, but she's much better than me. Isatis, she's a postdoc who's an expert in Greenland. Also, she's been a huge community leader in climate justice work. So at this point, I was hoping to have question and answers from the crowd, but I would love Isatis to share maybe her background. And in the meantime, I would like to invite you to think about some questions for the panelists. I hope what you learned today is not stopping here. Curiosity is actually becoming vulnerable. And I think it's so important to learn. Isatis, thank you for teaching me, and thank you for being here. I'm sorry for the time, but please go ahead
It's okay. Thank you.
And let us
This
know
is
about yourself. And please prepare some questions.
Yeah, this was such a great, introduction, the words that we heard from Skylar, and then this dynamic that Christina brought us. I think I would like to reflect a little bit on that. It kind of reminded me, I'm from Puerto Rico, and it reminded me of a rhythm that we have that is La Bomba. And La Bomba is also an Afro-descendant rhythm that slaves used in the plantations to kind of plan their escape, keep their roots, and form community. And I think that's so important, and I think that's some of the things that we can do as education, academia, in moving forward climate justice. I think that when we think about how we bring climate justice into education, it's like, how do we transform system? How do we make sure that when we're doing science, engineering, math, and we're including the arts, we're including the people, how do we co-create with them? So I think that that's some of my experience and kind of my passion. I think I will be more or less sure. I will talk to you about what I do, and then I would love to leave some space for people to speak and have questions. So I work at different levels. I worked at the international, at the national, and then at the local level. In the international level, I work a lot in the international negotiations, trying to figure it out. How do we engage in justice, climate justice specifically? How do we ingrain human rights? How do we ingrain participation, et cetera? And then, like, in my science, I connect, like, the Arctic with Puerto Rico, making sure that communities have the tools to make sure they can apportion the sources, like where is the pollution coming from, who is responsible, where are the needs and opportunities to cut down and really make sure that we're building healthier communities, right? I work in atmospheric chemistry and figuring out what are the sources of pollution, but then also what are the sinks that we have in our natural systems to kind of work with the problem. So in Greenland, I'm working on what is the impact of pollutants over the surface in the kind of influencing the albedo, which is the reflection of the glacier. I see a lot of people here, so I don't know how familiar you're with that term, but it's basically how much energy you can send back to the universe, right? And then in Puerto Rico, I work with coral reefs and trying to figure it out how much carbon can they uptake. Coral reefs, mangroves, like all coastal system, in trying to move into understanding what is our wealth, like our environmental wealth, because we often define wealth in terms of dollar signs, but small islands have a lot of wealth that is sometimes not understood as asset. So that's a little bit about what I do. Recently, I had one of my field work was in enabling some citizen assemblies. And then this citizen assembly, we have different phases. In the first phase, we bring together experts in the large word, right? Like, we're not talking about scientists, experts, or someone that has a PhD. We're recognizing the experience of lived experience, like the expertise of lived experience. And then also we have a phase where we are envisioning what is the future Puerto Rico that we want, and then also how do we strategize to make that a reality. So all of them, like, we facilitated a couple of events, and all of them ended with bomba, you know, and trying to create that community. So we're seeing there how through our work on research we can do co-creation of knowledge, how we can do action-based research, and then at the same time, how can we engage, like, culturally in these spaces. So I will leave it there.
Well, thanks. We have actually to leave in 1 or 2 minutes, and I know it was 2 minutes ago, but is there any quick burning question? By the way, we are still around even after the event. We'll reach out to Skylar, reach out to anyone. In 30 seconds, I wanted to make a quick statement. Knowledge is not built on numbers, and I'm an engineer. I think knowledge is really built on the interaction we saw today. Indigenous culture, long-term knowledge, future approaches, interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary approaches, curiosity. They are all fundamental ingredients in order for us to tackle properly the climate change, which is fundamentally a social justice issue. We need to switch in the culture, and I think the work that, of course, I'm humbly saying, the work that Christina, Isatis, and Skylar are doing is really accelerating and catalyzing the work that we're doing, all at the basic science level, because without the interaction, there will be no progress. I know they're looking at me like, say, you need to leave. If you really have questions, please reach us here or outside after the event. We're easy to find, and we're good to reply, and feel free to reach out. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'll grab the stool if it's easier.
Sorry for that. This is
You go ahead and grab one of the stools if that's easier. Yeah. I'll put it here for now.
How many mics do you need on this?
Oh, three.
Three.
So I just need one more. Thank you. Yes. It'll be visible in the recording, but it won't matter. It looks like it belongs there anyway. Test 1, 2. Yeah, I have this, then the pictures, and this, then the blackout. This way you can stop the show and then start the videos.
So wait, can you give me a run through? So you do that?
Well, this show, let me park this one. And then the two videos are sitting right here. He just starts them.
Can we embed them in there? Actually,
I could probably do that, I guess.
yeah. If we have some time, we just thought maybe
I
it might just be easier.
I don't know what time I got anymore because the schedule's all messed up.
Well, it's 12:55. I think we can run 3 minutes late if we need to. I think can you drag?
Yeah,
Oh, I see.
I was getting rid of the junk that it puts there.
That's pretty stressful.
Should I start on?
That's good.
Yeah, do you want me to start it on?
Click?
Yeah.
Well, what happens? Will he just?
Well, here we'll test it.
Yeah.
Let me just.
Yeah.
so he's got this, and it doesn't start.
He hits the arrow again.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Let's try that.
Come check this out.
Yes, okay, that works. All right, so he's just got to hit the advance. All right, so I'm going to start the show again. Should I still have this, the open house before the video?
I don't think so.
All right, so I'll dump this back here.
Well, right, but then you have to go to black, right?
Well, yeah, we have to go to black, but I might not use this blackout. I might, depending on how it goes. Or maybe I'll just dump it. I'll just dump this slide.
I'm going to go tell Mom. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. Antenna, and you're live.
Okay. Rip, I guess that's important. I guess.
So I will.
You can either use the slide advancer or use the arrow.
Just that. Okay. And how many slides do we have?
Oh, it's 9.
Okay.
So, yeah, so it's going to be her images. Then you're going to get to the video, and the video won't autoplay. Just hit the arrow again. It'll autoplay for Daniel's first video.
Okay.
And then hit the arrow again for load up the second video, and then hit the arrow again to play that, and then you're done.
Okay. Got it.
So just keep hitting the arrow.
Excellent.
Yeah,
All right.
at the very end of the black house.
Okay. And then we call them up. Is that how it goes?
This is going to get you. Right?
Okay. No, that's hot.
It's hot, but one.
No, it's cool. It's set up.
So should I wait to turn this on or not?
Oh, no, you're good.
Okay.
Yeah, you should turn it on when you come up that
Okay. So don't worry about that.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about that because it's set up to work with all house lights.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it'll only be a problem. Handheld mics on the panel or on the podium.
I don't know exactly what they did here. So
I'm sorry, I got immediately pulled into doing it.
So yes, okay. Do you see
So
these?
these are, this is like a zine that I made about the tea times in the second chapter of my PhD. This is some work I did in Antarctica. It's like an autoethnography of my body while doing work on Thwaites Glacier. This is some glitch art of a glacier in Alaska that I showed at a gallery in like 2019, and then these are some more. This is like zines that students made, kind of in the same vein as this here, like trying to figure out how to communicate climate.
So people still do zines?
People still do zines.
I thought that was like the 80s.
It was. We're bringing it back.
The zines are coming
The
back?
zines are back.
Like paper zines?
Truly,
For
yeah. I've
real?
got some here.
Oh,
Yeah.
I am such a boomer. I'm so clueless. I had no idea zines were back. Anyway, all right, cool. Yeah, yeah. All right, and what is this? Is that?
And then that's the same project here. We could even delete it. We don't like need to show more than
All right.
one image of it.
Okay.
Whatever you want.
All right. Well.
Do you want me to give you a hard out 150? Do you want me to give you a signal? For
Yeah, sure. Where will you be?
I'm going to be right here. In the
All right.
front.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just do
Well,
it.
so, you going to give me a time to go to audience too, or?
No, I mean, I think you feel like if you want me to, I can, but otherwise you can sort of.
But we're going to 150 no matter
Right,
what.
so you maybe only want 10 minutes of Q&A, you know.
All right, got it.
If
Okay,
you-
so
would you
do
be
I just
helpful if
start?
I gave you the Q&A? thing?
Absolutely. Yeah, if you don't mind, just
Okay.
to remind me.
Okay, I'll do
But
it.
am I starting or somebody? Oh, you do.
But I need to get my reading glasses because it's dark over here.
We good? Hi, everyone. We're just checking on some audio. Are we good? Louder? Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here on a lovely rainy day like this. We really appreciate it. And today we have just an incredible treat for you. And first, I guess I should introduce myself. I am Joey Parr. I'm the Executive Director of Public Affairs and Communications for the Columbia Climate School. Really excited to have you here. And we have an amazing opportunity to introduce you to Miles O'Brien, who is an award-winning journalist, science journalist. He covers climate, he covers science. You've seen him on CNN, PBS NewsHour. He's incredible. If you haven't seen, I have to put my glasses on because now I'm at that age. He reported, produced, and directed the NOVA documentary series, Chasing Carbon Zero. It's fantastic. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you look for it on your local PBS station. It's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to invite Miles up to the stage.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Checks in the mail on the plug. We appreciate that. Chasing Carbon Zero. And don't forget to support your PBS stations. We've got tote bags out the wazoo for you if you send us. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. We have three rising scientific stars here in the world of Lamont-Doherty, and I'm not one of them. I come from a different journalistic epoch, you might say, back when places like CNN had a science department of 8 people. On December 8th of 2008, we were all sent our walking papers. Because what do we know about the Kardashians, right? So we have some trends here that I want to explore with this next generation of scientists. We have a growing crisis with the climate. I don't need to belabor that issue with you. We all know that. We have a public that is perhaps not fully appreciating the urgency of the issue. And we have a scientific community that maybe, just maybe, present company accepted, is not doing a great job communicating the science in a way that the general public can connect with. Now, it used to be there was a cadre of professional journalists like me out there to sort of serve as a mediator between the world of science and the general public. But by and large, we all got shoved out the door because, again, what do we know about the Kardashians? So, but there are many other ways to communicate these days, and that represents, of course, an opportunity, but also a whole different set of challenges. And I'm curious what these young scientists are doing as a way to reach the public. Do they feel compelled to reach the public? Why? And what are the messages that resonate the most? The interesting thing here to me, one of the more interesting things, and this is what I wanted to explore with Chasing Carbon Zero, is the way that people in my profession have covered climate over the years, I think has done a pretty good job of disengaging the public to the extent that we make them afraid, and that fear without any sort of levers for action leads to kind of an apathy. And meanwhile, the world of science and engineering has come up with a whole panoply of solutions to the problem. And that story doesn't get told very well. And the truth is, the energy transition is happening really in spite of itself, in spite of the fossil fuel efforts to stop it. And there are actually pathways to reach the Paris goals if we take a little more of an urgent footing, more, dare I say, a wartime footing to all of this. But there is that, I think the general public is not fully up to speed on this. And finding ways to make them aware, number one, of this urgency, but also, number two, oh, you're not hearing me? I'm sorry. I would have projected a little more. Trying to increase the, that sense of urgency, but also, along with that, give people an idea that there are real solutions that we can drive towards. And it's not just about, you know, getting rid of the SUV and eating less meat. There are ways that we can fundamentally transform our society to wean ourselves off of fossil fuel if we decide to do it. So we're going to talk to these young people about how they're communicating, but because of the way the stage is set up, we have to look at their work first. So I want you to all commit this to memory. And so this is Elizabeth Case's work, and she is involved in glaciology. And, yes. And we're going to hear a little bit more about her use of art and science. She is melding both sides of her brain effectively. And that is as much as anything to reach the public, but also, I think, for her, a little bit of therapy as well. So we can talk about that as well. And then Daniel has stumbled onto Instagram fame. And let's listen to a little bit of what he does, really, which is great because ultimately he's finding science in places that we pretty much overlook all the time.
Come check this out. We are in the mountains of New Hampshire, and I think we found some metamorphosed turbidites. That sounds like a lot, but I'm going to break it down. Metamorphosis is a process that happens after rocks are made, right, through heat and pressure. And they're metamorphosed sedimentary rocks, so sediments like sand and clay that are deposited in the deep ocean. A turbidite is a debris flow, right? So it's something flowing down, the continental shelf or whatever. It'll be a mixture of sand and clay, and the sandy bits settle out first, right? Because they're heavier and the clay makes a thinner layer on top. And so here you see a whole sequence of these. They appear different than they would, in normal sedimentary rocks because of that heat. The clay is actually now a schist, but this is like a little sand bed overlain by the clayey material, and then comes another one, and then comes another one. This is usually a process associated with like tectonics, and that would make sense because there was a huge mountain building event here with the creation of Pangaea like 400 million years ago. Know what I'm saying?
Awesome. All right. That's my turbidite moment for the day right there. Here we go.
Come check this out. There's a little crescent-shaped hole in the snow, and if you look at it closely, you can see there's a stick inside of it. That's exactly the shape. This is a good demonstration of a phenomenon called albedo. Snow is highly reflective, so it reflects the energy of the sun back into space. The stick has a darker color, which means that it absorbs more energy, and so every day the stick heats up more than the snow, and it actually sinks right in.
Rocks! All right, let's bring him up on the stage. And we don't have any visual representation of Bennett's work in tackling curriculum, but we'll get deep into that as well. So let's come on up to the stage and we'll talk about how you communicate to the public in this disintermediated, fragmented world of ours. Come on up. So, Bennett, since we didn't have anything to, to show at the beginning for you. We'll let you go first.
Okay, sure.
Tell me, I think I'm set. I should be set, yeah. Tell me a little bit about how you're going to make science more exciting for young people. As a person who has a little bit of PTSD over the periodic table still, and found myself a history major covering science, that's a whole long story. But I wonder sometimes if I had been taught science a little differently, how my path might have been changed. And I'm curious, as you look at, you're kind of focusing a little bit on curriculum, and I know your area of interest is dinosaurs, which immediately makes you, connected to 9-year-old boys the world over. But so tell me a little bit about it when you try to rethink how science is taught. How do you go about that?
Sure. I think I would start by saying your story is far from unique. Too many people get turned away by this idea that science is really dogmatic and that it's just memorizing facts and pieces of information. And that's not at all what most scientists are doing on a day-to-day basis. Science is really creative. You're taking new pieces of information and combining them and finding new ways to put them together. And I think one of the big opportunities that we have is to kind of shift from saying, oh, we need teachers who teach creatively to methods where we're teaching creativity. And the scientific learning becomes almost a byproduct of the engagement and the creative expression that the students are able to get through kind of tackling real world problems hands-on.
So do teachers have the freedom to do that, though, given the constraints of all the testing and so forth that they have to incorporate into their curriculum?
I mean, I think that's absolutely a piece of the problem, right? Especially in, a lot of public school education curriculums are stuck to what the state or the education board mandates needs to be taught. But for me, I'm saying, okay, the last science class people probably ever take, if they're non-scientists, is a college-level intro class, to fulfill your science requirement. And what can we do at that level as a start to make sure that people do not kind of leave their exposure to science and become more passive consumers of science with a bad taste in their mouth, with this PTSD about the periodic table. So how can we make those college intro level classes where people have some basic science and math skills already and are sort of for the last time engaging with science in a classroom setting, how can we make that a good experience that gives them an appreciation for this is what it's like to be a scientist? And it's for a lot of people not that far off from sort of techniques of questioning and idea formulation that they might use in their lives already, but they just haven't recognized that that in itself is science.
So as I came to understand science better, I realized it actually probably takes a lot of work for a scientist to wring the excitement out of science, right? For a teacher to do that, and that's what happens. Daniel, tell me a little bit about how you've got 45,000+ followers on Instagram. Congratulations for creating an audience. But I think one of the things that makes it, really connect with people is that you're talking about a rock that a lot of people would have hiked by, and all of a sudden we're deep into turbidites, and I probably said that wrong. But anyway, tell me, did you have a specific audience in mind, or did you just kind of stumble into this conversation with people out there, and who are they?
I prefer the explanation of the stumbling, actually. I don't know, I'm not trying to be humble whenever I say that I feel like really, like whatever the secret mathematics of the Instagram algorithm are really responsible for what I'm doing. I can really actually thank my girlfriend for, like, I'm chatting her ear off whenever we're going on a hike, and I'm like, look at this rock, like, this was clearly a lateral moraine, right? And maybe it's, younger dry ice, maybe it's whatever. So I'm just chatting this off, and she says, like, you must do this on a video, and you're gonna put it on Instagram once a week on Tuesday at 10 a.m. And my theory is that Instagram is really like trying to fill out every niche, right? They want people to be there and able to experience anything they want. And people are hungry for this information. And I just happened to do it consistently for a few weeks, maybe like a month. And then they're like, okay, this guy's doing it. Let's get him 30,000 followers or whatever. And it happened, right? If I was trying to be like a fitness influencer or something, it would be very different, right? That's a saturated space. But people want to learn, and increasingly, like TikTok, young people will tell me, undergraduates, they're like, I'm using this like Google. And that's incredible for me as someone who's 30 years old. But people want this. And if you're willing to put yourself out there, Instagram, these algorithms, whatever it is, they will find you your audience about whatever it is.
So what's your advice then to other scientists? If you're inclined, do this, give it a try, see what happens. There is this kind of thirst?
Share your passion and be courageous. Someone this morning, literally, I opened it up, an a geologist. He's not my nemesis, but I've followed him for 10 years since I had this started. And he's like, Daniel, it's not twinning that causes chatoyancy and labradorite. It's exolution lamellae. And I'm like, okay, you are one out of the, no, I'm actually, thank you. Like, and I'll pin the comment. I said, everyone learn from this guy. He really knows what's happening. But he's the one person out of the 20,000 people that watched the video that knew that. And I'm embarrassed, of course. But.
So I think you hit on something that's very important there, though. I think and there's probably a generational component to this as well, but the idea that scientists are in the ivory tower and are not interested in engaging with any ideas from mere mortals. But you're willing to mix it up with people, and they may or may, even without potential PhD or your postdoc, I know, but whatever, without all the sheepskin, they might know something, right?
They do. They definitely do. There's another hilarious video of this. The video's not funny, but the guy's comment is funny. I was taking a hike on Storm King, and I'm like, this is the lowest latitude fjord on the planet. Like, such a cool, fun little story, and people eat this up, what have you, but there's some guy who says, I've done that hike. The Hudson River is actually that way. And I didn't know it just because I'd gotten turned around in all these corners. And I once again, I pinned this comment and I say, sorry, everyone, I got that wrong. And the dude is like, much kinder than your colleagues in science. He says, wow, like it takes a real man to admit whenever he's wrong. And I'm like, I pointed the wrong way to the river. Like, it's not a big deal. That's my little anecdote about it.
And that's kind of like your home mountain, too. You should know it for sure, right?
I don't.
Right?
Not well enough, apparently.
All right, Elizabeth, you spend a lot of time on places like Thwaites, which we've often called the Doomsday Glacier. That's and the more you spend time there and understand what's happening, what the potential consequences of Thwaites dropping into the water and what happens when everything slides in behind it, it's easy to get pretty depressed. How do you grapple with? You're kind of sitting there in the midst of this amazing beauty, realizing it's kind of melting sort of before your eyes. So how do you communicate that dichotomy to your audience?
Yeah, Thwaites Glacier is a glacier in West Antarctica. It's one of the largest outlet glaciers, and it flows really fast towards the sea, and we're seeing it speed up, and we're seeing sort of these processes happen that feel pretty catastrophic. But when you're out there, like doing your science or whatever on the glacier, you like look around and it's 360 degrees of flat ice. Like, it doesn't feel possible that the 2+ kilometers of ice that I'm standing on that goes on for hundreds of miles in literally every direction could be changing as fast as we're seeing it happen, both from the ground and from space. And we see this in all the glaciated places that I work, in Juneau, Alaska, in the Tetons, in Antarctica. And this change is happening both at rates that feel like impossible to witness on a day-to-day basis, and then also like catastrophically fast. And there's a lot of like grief that comes along with that, especially for the communities that live there. Not in Antarctica, obviously, but in Alaska and Wyoming and all these mountainous regions. And I think that's part of what makes these efforts like so valuable. Like, people are thirsting for information to understand the world around them, to figure out how to process like all the change that's happening, to like give voice to the crisis that's happening and the like emotions that they're feeling along with that inside their body. There's all this loss that goes along with that, and I think that that's where like art can really play an important role, hand in hand with science, to help folks understand what's happening around them, and then be able to like process and share that kind of like loss and change.
So I gather you've always been artistic.
No, I wouldn't say. I mean, I'm definitely like I'm like a really bad drawer, like extremely bad at like technical drawing or whatever. But I do find a lot of places and a lot of things really beautiful, and I love to share. Like that is what I want to share, is that feeling of awe. And it feels the same when I'm in Alaska looking out in the mountain range, or when I'm crossing the GW Bridge and it's like sunset over New York City. Like that sense of awe feels really comparable. And I don't think you don't need to be like a great drawer or anything to make this art. A lot of what I do is made with one sheet of paper and like a pastel, and it smears and it gets all over the place, and my hands are blue right now from a printmaking project we're doing out in one of the tents. And there's all these ways of doing art that don't require sort of like technical expertise. They just require you to want to be a little bit vulnerable and kind of share what you see, what you love.
So scientists, spend their careers in pursuit of, the quintessential paper that'll get you, on the cover of Science. And do you think that, in some ways, art has a way of reaching others in a more profound way than that, or is it just a different group of people?
I think that there's no wrong way of getting to know something. Like science is one way that people really vibe with, and some people work really well with like understanding the numbers or these models or these observations. And I think in many ways we're all scientists when we go out and we're like, this is like the 16th October in a row where the leaves have turned later than they did the year before or whatever. But art is another way that folks understand and relate to things, and both science and art, I think, are these really powerful research processes, where science is happening. We have like sort of like one mode we go about getting to know something through science, this like positivist mode where we're like looking at facts and we're understanding observations and we're developing theories and we're testing those. And then we have like another approach, in this case art, which is often a lot more like embodied or experimental. The process is part of the discovery. And I think that these science and art share a lot in common in getting to know something.
So Bennett, I think we can all agree here that the amount of concern and urgency that most scientists in this space have is a lot higher than the public probably fully understands, and certainly more urgency than the average person in the public feels. There's this big disconnect there, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the things that at the root of this is I think a widespread misunderstanding of what science is, what scientists do, and how the process works. How can science education help this? Because ultimately, I mean, we're talking about long-term solutions here, but ultimately it does begin at that age, at the young age when we're first teaching young people science, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of what needs to happen is that we need to make very clear to everyone that science is much more of a method than it is a collection of discoveries. As scientists, we are making ideas and then testing those ideas, and that's the process of science, not the discoveries that you make along the way. And I think if we can engage students into believing that this is not about finding more problems with the world. We don't need to look for what's going wrong with the climate crisis to bum ourselves out. We are opening up opportunities to make a difference. And when you teach students to be creative and to problem solve by connecting different domains of knowledge that they might have, that their friends might have, and you build this kind of experience that science is building that web and drawing together disparate pieces of knowledge to achieve a common goal, then you can start to see science as a solution maker. And when I think we have this solution maker, we can shift towards a more kind of hopeful alternative, right? the climate is changing, but here's what we can do about it. And here's what I, as a student, or I, as a teacher, am excited to do to take my own part in it. And I think that'll really kind of, that sense of ownership and agency is what's missing for a lot of people who are just feeling this sense of despair and this kind of either growing urge to ignore it and stick their head in the sand, or growing urge to give up and wail about it because it seems like nothing's changing.
How much do you think that the term we use a lot is scientific illiteracy, which is pretty much a pejorative, but I mean, there is a gap there, right? How much of that do you think feeds into this whole lack of full and complete understanding of the nature of the problem and the potential for solutions? Or is there something else at play? There are other things at play, obviously, but how much is this part of it?
I think that's absolutely a major part of it. There are probably every scientist in the world could have their own opinion about what was happening to the climate, and there's massive disagreements between people, but those massive disagreements are about typically, how do we define the error bars, like how is this going to have an impact on this specific region on Earth, not the fact that there is something happening and we need to do something about it. And when people get caught up in this like, oh, well, this is only a theory or this is only an idea, without sort of realizing and having the scientific wherewithal to parse through that and say, okay, well, an IPCC report is very different than an individual research paper. And, learning to recognize which things are the result of lots and lots of expertise coming together and which are individual people who might disagree, and kind of parse through that, I think plays a huge role in people's sort of inability to wrap their heads around what's happening.
So Daniel, when you do your Instagrams, are you thinking that you're educating people or just kind of, capturing their attention a little bit, maybe getting them to think slightly different? I mean, in other words, are you popularizing science, or do you see it sort of as Instagram curriculum?
I'm really hoping that it's the first one. I'm trying to keep my, what's the word? There's some sort of moral sense about what I feel comfortable publishing. There's people who go with the trends and will do a dance or whatever and add rocks to it. I'm not trying to do that. I have a passion for the Earth, and I feel like the Earth and climate and rocks don't really have a spokespeople or spokesperson or spokespeople in the same way that if you think about stars, you think about Carl Sagan, or you think about conservation biology and you think about David Attenborough. But there's fantastic stories that I think have a lot of parallel. Space is far away, deep time. Rocks are the same. And I just want to bring my sense of excitement and just give people an opportunity to feel that same way. So it's edutainment.
So
I must be conscious of both. I look at my loss curves or whatever in my insights, and I'm like, all right, what graphic lost them this time? So I need to pay attention, but I don't want to post garbage.
So yeah, you should do that. But
Yeah.
so it's interesting you mentioned Carl Sagan, because in his day, probably one of the first great science popularizer, right? I think we could agree, right? And he shows up on the Johnny Carson show. That was a late night television show, by the way. And the chaperone up here. You kids, get off my lawn. Anyway, so he would show up, and all of his colleagues would be, they'd be firing arrows into his back. Does that exist still today? I mean, do your colleagues say, come on, get real, do a proper paper instead of your stupid Instagram or that kind of thing? How does that go down? Or are they like, yeah, good on you, keep going?
Is my boss here? It's not going to get me a job as a professor.
Right. It doesn't really help, does it? Right?
It's not.
Or does it?
I think that it's going to help me in the world.
Well, if you help the world too, that's good too, right?
Right. That's maybe better even. I would love to be a professor. It's a hard path. I'm passionate about this, and I'm not afraid to spend my time doing it. Arnold Gordon, I was talking with him last night, for anyone who knows him, is a legend of oceanography. And I told him about what I was doing. I told him about what an impact he'd made on my career, and he says, "You're doing the right thing. Like, don't become a professor anymore." I'm not telling that to the kids out there. It's a beautiful goal, but he said, like, we need to like change the world. We know a lot of things, you know. So get out there and try and do it, whether that's with technology, with art, you know, with communication. There needs to be these people. And my colleagues, I would say in general, if you're not my boss, paying me on a grant to do research and I'm spending time doing this, you're like, well, that's really sick. I'm glad that's happening. And everyone on the internet who comments, everyone is positive. Yeah, unless you're a climate denier. There's a few of those. But it's very positive. It's not going to get me my professor job, but I'm okay with that.
Yeah, Elizabeth, as long as you brought up the denier thing, to what extent, and I guess all of you might be included in this question, but to what extent do you want to address deniers, or is that a waste of time? I mean, there are people who still believe the earth is flat too. Is it worth even tackling deniers?
Well, I think this relates to an earlier question you asked too about scientific literacy, which is that we have to recognize that this sort of lack of support or stripping of funding from science education, this de-emphasis of sort of critical reasoning in our schools, a lot of it is extremely intentional on the parts of certain actors. And so I don't think there's straight up, there is no sort of single individual or that's at fault for not understanding the science of climate change. That's something that was done very deliberately to a lot of people over the last few decades. And so I think as a scientist, both like a scientist, but also just as a citizen, as like a human living on this planet, I feel like my job is to sort of just like relate to people and meet them where they are. And if we can have like an honest and vulnerable exchange like that, I think to me is all that I can ask for from people. So I think everyone's coming at this from, you know, like their culture, their society, this like long history of very intentional and well-funded climate denialism. I think we have to recognize that these forces at play have shaped how people and individuals react and know science nowadays.
Yeah, so science is up against well-funded people who are expert at purveying lies, and scientists just say, well, have you read the studies, you know, and it doesn't, there's an asymmetrical thing here when you've got such well-funded propaganda versus people who are just trying to let the numbers show. So I guess the question is this generation of scientists different? I'll start with you, Elizabeth. Because, number one, there's no CNN science desk to call anymore to get a story on, and there's no other way necessarily to get your story out there. Are there more and more people in your generation of science that are doing these kinds of things?
I think there's been scientists doing this from as early as we've had science. There's Alexander von Humboldt and the diaries that he published in the 1700s with these sort of like beautiful narratives. There's been sort of like, ever since people have been sort of learning and discovering things, there's been a desire to both like recognize the beauty of the planet. People, you know, like we think about like George Hutton and geology and like the fact that he basically figured out geology by walking around a lot and like looking at things. Like that's what he did, which is kind of like what Daniel does. You know what I mean? Like, and like
he just brings an iPhone with him.
He just brings. He just has.
The
Yeah.
difference, right?
If Hutton had an iPhone, I don't know. Yeah. I'm getting away from, I guess, like your initial question, but like I think there's like this terrific and like wonderful thirst to sort of like share what we love, and also from everybody. Like I guess like I bristle a little bit against the sort of like differentiation between sort of like science and scientists and the public. Like I don't think there is like there's no boundary between the two of those. Like we're members of the public and we are scientists, and there's folks who are scientists who don't have any degrees, but have taught us so much about how we like live and move through this world. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I think that there's like thirst all around for this kind of like information and ways of understanding the world, and it comes in a lot of different ways: science, art, education, communication, cooking, whatever. Like, there's so many different ways of understanding how our world works, and I think that like sort of like people respond to beauty and like have curiosity. These are like very fundamental to what it means to be human.
Bennett, do you think that scientists have an obligation to do this, to reach out to the public above and beyond their other scientific research duties? And not every scientist is good and clever at doing this, right? But do you think it should be part of the job?
I'm unsure there. I wouldn't go so far as an obligation maybe, but an opportunity definitely. Every scientist I know is passionate about something. It comes with the spending hours and hours looking at something small or something huge, but the kind of appreciation and the awe that they develop can be a powerful tool for reaching people. And if people are honest about why they do what they do and what interests them about it, then I think every scientist has an opportunity to make connections with people. I think it should be done more. I think there should be more value placed on your ability to draw people into the fold. But I wouldn't say it's an obligation. You know, some people really want to be the best in the world at tackling a specific problem. I would say there's nothing wrong with that. We need people who are the best in the world at doing things. But other people want to connect those ideas and figure out how to use them to inspire people or engage people or tackle world problems, and there should be room for that as well. And I think it's, for me, about connecting people to the resources to make things happen and making sure that we're not losing people along the way for reasons that aren't related to the science. You know, if everyone who was quitting science in college was quitting because they really didn't want to do science, then I'd throw up my hands and say, okay, you know, that's fine. You don't have to do this. But if we're losing people for reasons that aren't related to the science, I think there's an opportunity to fix that, and in doing so, to connect with the broader world.
Daniel, I think a lot of people in the general public, their only interaction with a scientist is probably watching the local weather forecast, right? And you by putting yourself out there are helping portray scientists in a way that Hollywood does not. Is that part of what you're thinking as you do what you do?
Yeah. I mean, it's vulnerable, and I think like humanizing. I mean, actually, so another series that I'm doing at the same time in cooperation with Joey and Tara and Francesco and people from the climate school is, this is definitely stolen from TikTok. Sorry, Caleb Simpson et al. I don't know if y'all seen these videos where they're doing apartment tours. The appearance is that he's approaching some stranger and he's like, how much you pay for rent in New York City? Can I see your apartment? And so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna just steal this like everyone else does. And so I'll approach a willing scientist. You know, we've agreed on things beforehand. And I'm like, what do you do for work? And the idea is that hopefully they'll say something mystifying like, I'm a paleoceanographer, or I do greenhouse gas chemistry, or I'm a cryospheric geophysicist. And that might be enough to get someone's attention, and they can say, wow, what is that? And you know, you cut to these like fantastic spaces that we work in, like the core lab, or the machine shop, or this car that Rasheen and Yue use that looks like the Google car or something like that. And you know, hopefully it's engaging enough to keep people's attention. And you learn about, you know, the importance of methane as a trace gas in the atmosphere and its unknown sources, or, you know, the thickness of the Thwaites Glacier. But you also see their personal side. Like, you know, Andrani has a tattoo of a 5-point star, and one of the little stars is halfway open. And she's like, I put a lot of good stuff in there. You know, it's like, it's cute. Like, this is a human being. And yeah, so an effort to personalize and humanize scientists. I think it appeals to what Liz is saying.
You're not asking like how much grant funding they're getting?
No.
Hey, how much grant funding have you got?
Yeah, $100. No, the point is to appeal to people's humanity. Maybe they don't care about Thwaites. Maybe they're skeptical of something about Thwaites Glacier. But if they like Indrani, they'd be more likely to trust what she says.
All right, so we've got about 9 minutes left. So if you have questions, now would be the time to find your way to a microphone. I don't know how exactly that works, but in the meantime, I am interested, and I'll start with you, Elizabeth, because we're down at that end. I'm interested in speaking of solutions, let's talk about solutions to further amplifying the voices of scientists who don't have necessarily science journalists to work as an intermediator anymore. What's the best advice to scientists? And for that matter, the members of the public here, how do you sort through? I mean, when I started in the business, CNN was a department store. We had every, aspect of news was in one place, and now everybody has to seek out a little boutique of information, and you guys represent little boutiques right here. How can the public find you? How can scientists reach an audience? That's a big one. Go for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of sort of like amazing opportunity right now. Daniel's doing it through Instagram. There are folks doing it through TikTok. Like I had a friend who I worked with at the Grand Teton National Park for a summer who brought mini pickles, like little pickles up to each glacier that we were surveying, and she dressed them in Barbie clothes. And she made a video at the end of the summer and got 1.5 million views on TikTok. Like what better science communication?
Barbie pickle.
It's a Barbie pickle. It's Barbie pickle science communication.
I'm all in on that.
But there's also like Substack. There's like all these different sort of social medias now. And while it is potentially a little bit more difficult to parse through who is sort of like trustworthy, there's also a lot of information out there that folks can draw from. Like even like Wikipedia is getting really good. You get a lot of scientists sort of doing all of these like fact-checking Wikipedia, so you can like go learn the basics and then like follow the references to the scientists that are doing the work or the papers where they are. And like folks are like, if just like random members of the public like emailed me asking questions about glaciers, I would be like so excited to open those. Way more fun than getting emails from my advisor. He's not here either. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, I think it is just really important to remember that like we're all humans. We're all members of the public. There's a lot that we know. There's a lot that we don't know. And same with everyone here. Like I feel like every single person I meet, always I'm learning something from them. I'm learning how to ask a better question. I'm learning how to like stay curious about something. I'm learning how to see something from a different point of view. And it's just like that's what we're trying to bring to the table.
If you can share that enthusiasm and passion with people, they're going to connect with you. But it's difficult figuring that out. Do we have any questions for the audience at all? And there's one in the back. If we head up there, but yeah, I'm interested, Bennett. What are your thoughts on how to enhance, amplify, create better connections between the world of science and the public? What would you say?
I think for me, most of the science people will take in, at least in the most concentrated amount in their life, is in the classroom. And so for me, it all comes back to, how can we set people up to be engaged in science and to understand what scientists are doing through a holistic education about what science is. And so, I mean, I think it's so valuable to have people who are meeting people wherever they're at, either later in life or while they're in school and are looking for things outside of that. But I think we also need to focus on the places where we have pre-programmed science interaction. How can we make those engaging and exciting, and how can we keep people sticking around?
Question in the back.
So I'm an environmental science major. I'm currently getting my associates at my local community college. And I wanted to ask, like, how could I break into the field? Like, how did you guys end up getting jobs and all of these, like, amazing opportunities, like, where you get research grants and things like that? I'm just beginning to do, like, science classes and stuff like that. I had some prerequisites before. And I'm looking ahead at, like, what I'd need to do, and it's a little overwhelming. So what did you guys do to get to the point where you are?
Oh boy, career advice. Start with Instagram. No, what do you think, Daniel? Is Instagram going to get her anywhere, or should it's
maybe
not going to do it, right?
If you're specifically interested in research, apply to Lamont / Columbia's REU. It's open to anyone from across the country, and they'll pay you. I started off, I didn't do the REU. I had, after my bachelor's
I'm sorry,
degree,
REU, what does that stand for?
Are you? I guess it's a
Research experience for undergraduates.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Very
Thank you so much.
So
Yeah.
is it like an internship? Is that it?
It's like a summer
Yeah,
internship.
yeah.
Also, like, find a
Basically,
professor.
You have to work for free, is what he's saying.
No, they pay you.
Oh, you get paid.
They
Jeez.
pay you.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Also, you know,
Better than
maybe one of
journalism.
the professors at your university has a grant, and you can go and civ forams for them, or whatever it is that whatever class that you like the most. Go talk to that professor and be like, "How do I do this?"
Yeah, and I will say I got to science in a really roundabout way. I started college as a communications major, and I ended up studying physics, but after college I worked as an environmental journalist and sort of just like kind of found my way into these things. A lot of what I've done is again, yeah, just like cold email or going to talk to people, like reading those papers, going to talk to folks like based on the information that you found really interesting and seeing like who has like opportunities for you to work with, but also just like what their experiences are in the places that they have worked in. So, but yeah, I think it's really important to know that like most, if not every science research internship or job or whatever that you have should be paid, and you shouldn't be doing any school, like science school, like postgraduate school for free. So like PhDs are paid programs. You get salaries for them. Like, I think that's really important to know. Like REUs are paid. Like none of this work you should be doing for free. Yeah.
You really are a journalist who got smart, aren't you? Yeah. All right. So what's your advice?
I would say I would echo what's been said before. I did an RU experience as an undergrad. I loved it, and a lot of them are specifically focused on taking people who are not from four-year universities, you know, who are in community college or are in non-traditional educational backgrounds. And so, you know, don't be afraid to put yourself out there and try to make connections with people. I think most of the success I've had because I made friends with a TA or a professor, or, you know, gotten someone's good graces by being engaged with them and by being excited about what they do. And, you know, just hold on to those connections and then ride them as far as they'll take you. And someday you might be here.
Some good advice there. I hope you're taking notes on that one. Do we have another question? No.
A girl approached me she said, I'm a freshman at Columbia, and she's like, do you need a research assistant? I was at my open house exhibit. So like, seriously, and I'm like,
That's
maybe.
How you do it, right?
Maybe.
All right.
Yeah.
Question over here.
So I'm a science teacher, and one of the things that I try to deal with is how to explain to people that don't believe that there's climate change, that there's really climate change. So I guess one of the problems is it's a complex science. So it's easy to come up with exceptions. Like if you say that the temperature goes up each year, then you discover, oh wait, this such and such a year was one where it didn't go up. So what is a convincing way of trying to let people know why you think climate change is real? Thank you.
Do you mind? I can go.
Yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, if
someone, the bit on this one. This is good. I like this. Go, guys.
If someone doesn't believe, they're not going to believe. There's nothing you can do. There are people out there like that. But my favorite data sets are ice cores. I love the Vostok ice core record. Atmospheric CO2 correlating perfectly with temperature over 800,000 years. I like to think about atmospheric radiocarbon and the dilution of dead fossil fuels. And then all you need is just like radiative forcing and greenhouse gases with CO2. There's 3 parts. There's not one smoking gun for climate change, but if I had to write like a BuzzFeed 3 bullet point list, those are my 3. Please, other people.
I'd say there's somewhere on campus, I saw it displayed today, there's a color-coded temperature record that I think is a phenomenal tool for looking at how the climate's been changing, because it doesn't change in the same way every year. But if you take the annual mean temperatures, they're going up and up and up. And so you can see on these, some people make them for daily in their region, where they'll make like a giant quilt that has a temperature color-coded or a color-coded temperature banding of the years. And you can see them go up and up and up. And then I remember a few years ago, there was a New York Times article that looked at the amount of 95 degrees or warmer days in a year, and how that's been increasing steadily. Because for me, it's really important to try and connect with people on their terms, especially if they're trying to look for ways to discredit you. You know, you can say, well, in your own life, how have you seen these changes? And I think people are much more willing to come to you when they're like, oh, the summers have been getting hotter every year, or, you know, the winters have been getting more mild, or even looking at like the amount of hurricanes we get in this region, right, has been going up and up and up. And that's stuff you see over your own lifetime. And so people have the experience to kind of meet you halfway at that point. And I would also say to try and avoid using the word climate change until the very last minute. You know, if you can say, oh, what have you noticed about how the weather has changed in your lifetime, right? Then you can get people going, and you can get them to agree with you before they get lost on the buzzword, or they get lost on something that becomes not a rational trigger, but an emotional trigger, and kind of trying to keep people with you the whole way until you can say, and now what you're saying to me is it's getting a little bit warmer every year, and it's been doing that for your whole life. And doesn't that sound like the climate is warming up, or the globe is warming? And then people might be able to buy in with you in a way that they wouldn't if you were just saying, you know, you're wrong, I'm right, look at my evidence.
Final thought. Go ahead.
I also think we're facing a variety of different crises. So they're all connected, but they can be sort of approached in these different ways. So we're seeing global warming, this like average warming over time, but we're also seeing loss of biodiversity and invasive species. Like this year, everyone's killing lanternflies, like things like that, where we're seeing these like changes happen and sweep through where people's like local neighborhoods and regional areas. I love focusing on sort of like regional change, where we see, you know, like if you're in Oklahoma, the Ogallala like reservoir draining, things like that, that are like very personal and show change on these human timescales of these sort of like really old things, like aquifers that have been there for tens of thousands of years. I mean, these are really, really difficult and gigantic scales for people to think on. Like the Earth is really big, and like time is really long, and so it like makes a lot of sense that folks have a tough time sort of like coping with this all at once. So yeah, I think breaking it down and figuring out sort of like what do these people care? If what they care about is their apple crop, or what they care about is sort of like what car they can drive or whatever. Like everyone's got something that they really care about, and like that's sort of like where I go in, is just like understanding what they care about and then figuring out how like to communicate the sort of like change that's happening for them and where they live.
All right, guys, go Gen Z.
I'm a millennial.
I gotta say, if you ever get discouraged about where the world's headed, just remember this conversation and these young people trying to, you know, move the needle. We appreciate your efforts, and keep doing what you're doing, please. Thank you for your insights, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Miles.
Thank you.
want to leave it up here?
Hey, how are you doing? Yeah, everything starts later than
You're now live. And it's set up to work with, oh.
So here at Lamont, we have this thing called Lamont time. Okay, which is usually about 5 or 6 minutes after the hour, and that's when things always start. Because it takes a while to get from one place to another, I guess. That's why. So we'll just start in just another minute. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody here. I'm Steve Goldstein. I'm the interim director of the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, and I'm a professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences here at Columbia. And I'm so happy that so many people have come to open house today. I was really scared because of the weather. But we are geologists. Those of us who work here, many of us are geologists. We brave the weather, and it's good to see other people do that too. Right, so welcome to Open House. This year, characteristic of all our open houses, what we do is we offer an opportunity to experience our breakthrough science in action. And Open House serves several objectives. One is that we seek to raise the awareness about the workings of our planet. We study geoscience here. We seek to raise awareness of the changes we face in a warming climate, and I guess that's one of the things everybody who's here is interested in, because that's what this talk is about. We hope to ignite a deep and abiding interest in science. We hope to engage school-aged children and young adults with stories about our natural world, and there are a lot of children-friendly things here. And we want to plant in their minds the idea that a career in the earth and environmental sciences can be enjoying, exciting, and rewarding. And speaking for myself, it is. The lecture component of the day is an opportunity to hear directly from a series of top researchers that work here, where they bring you right into their world of inquiry, describing their work and connecting their research with the rest of us. So for this, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Alexander Desherbinen. He's a senior research scientist, and he's the deputy director of what we call CEASON, the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, and he's an adjunct professor of climate here in the Columbia Climate School. He studied geography. He has his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth. He has a master's from Syracuse and a PhD from the University of Twente. Is that how you pronounce it? In the Netherlands, Twente? Anyway. Okay, thank you. In geoinformation science and Earth observation. His research interests focus on the human aspects of global environmental change and geospatial data applications, integration, and dissemination. And his interests include climate change vulnerability, mapping and migration, resettlement in the context of climate change, urban climate vulnerability and resilience, population dynamics and the environment, and integration of remote sensing and socioeconomic data. He's managed projects under contract with NASA, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the World Bank, UN Environment, etc. And his talk today is Climate Refugees, Media Portrayals versus the Reality of Climate-Related Migration. And just to note something about myself, I've been spending, I've done a lot of research in the Middle East, and the Middle East is undergoing a long time drought, and there have been a lot of population disruptions already as a result of that drought, and climate models predict that area, and I'm talking about Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, the climate models predict that it's going to be getting drier in the future. So climate refugees, I think, is a real real issue. We'll hear what Professor Desherbinen has to say about it. So, thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to probably skip a few slides in the interest of time. It's like Mark Twain. If I'd had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter. But I think we're going to get the gist of it. And one of the things that we do at, here's my title slide, at Season, which you can read the full name down below, but that we tend to go by our acronym, Season, is integrate earth science data, the kind of data that are produced here at Lamont, climate science, hydrological, other data, and socioeconomic data. So you're going to see a lot of maps. You'll see a lot of the kinds of things that we do. If you visited our booth, which is the first booth when you come down the pathway, number 4, you'll see more maps. So if you want to go by there on the way back, you're welcome to do so. This was a picture taken by one of my colleagues who's actually right here, Kit McManus, and he loves drones. So he took a picture of us from a drone in front of Geoscience Building. But this is a little bit about what Season does, and we're really the kind of lead geospatial group at Columbia University and at the Climate School. So what is the evidence for climate mobility? There's a lot of headlines these days. I think most of you probably have not been able to escape periodic headlines such as these ones, suggesting that there'll be waves of mass migration coming to the US, coming to Europe, coming to other parts of the world where they perceive conditions to be better. These often play on fear and anxiety around migration. In some cases, they're well-intentioned and they're attempting to get people to wake up to the reality of climate change and the fact that the impacts are much worse in low-income parts of the world than they are often here in North America, for instance. We have higher income, we have the ability to cope with a lot of the changes that are occurring. So I think it's not entirely malicious or fear-mongering, but it's an attempt to essentially say, hey, if we reduce emissions, it's going to be good for a lot of other people as well. So what I want to do, though, is unpack a bit. And I think it's important to just start out by saying that even if we meet the 1.5 degree C warming target that was set in 2015 in Paris, we will still see a lot of disruptions to social systems. And so we, as well in the US, we already saw this with the massive heat waves in 2023. We also saw the fires in Quebec. And so these climate signals in some ways are already baked in, a certain degree of warming and a certain degree of inertia in the system is already baked in. So we're going to see more of this kind of thing, floods, droughts, fires, along with disruptions to food production systems and natural ecosystems, and in short, transformation of the planet in ways we cannot foresee. As a geographer, not as a strictly speaking an earth scientist, I'm very interested in questions around habitability. What makes a place habitable? How can we actually think about habitability from a both social and environmental perspective? I think some of you live in this area because you like the amenities of New York City, for instance. You like your social networks, you like the school systems, things like that make places actually habitable. It's not purely a function of climate. So in the IPCC realm, one of the diagrams that sort of attracted my attention a lot is this one, which looks at risk levels. And back around the fourth or fifth assessment, they turned to a risk framing for the IPCC assessments. And the idea is that you have both magnitude or intensity of the adverse impacts. So think about heat waves. It's going to get hotter and hotter, or it'll get the cyclones will get more intense. But they will also return with increasing frequency in some cases. Now, this is not going to happen everywhere, and I don't want to be alarmist again, but what happens is you could reach a threshold whereby adaptation solutions are limited. So what do you do then? Can you actually adapt in situ or in place, or do you have to move to be in a better position? So Radley Horton and I, Radley is a climate scientist here at Lamont, have worked together a bit on some of these issues. And we wrote this paper for Science, which looked at habitability and human migration. And what we tried to do is look at it both from a top-down kind of modeling perspective, which is what a lot of geoscientists do, the climate scientists. They can tell you where temperatures are going to exceed a certain threshold by 2050 or 2100 with certain frequency. They can tell you certain things about rainfall patterns. But that doesn't tell you the whole story, so we wanted to encourage people to think from the bottom up as well, and what are the sort of social resilience elements and the economic factors that may cause people to either stay in place or move. These are a bunch of different efforts that I've collated from dating back to 2006 of efforts to basically map where climate impacts might be most severe. So you have the bigger circles in this diagram basically represent more severe impacts, particularly in the high latitudes, in the Arctic, parts of southern Mediterranean, the drylands and the arid areas of the southwest US and Mexico. All of these were considered by that author, and according to the climate models he used, to be at risk. Then you have maps like this one from the UK Met Office. The Hadley Center is one of the major centers that develops future climate projections, and it's really temperature-based, and they use a slightly different way. But again, the Arctic regions and parts of the Amazon are considered to be at risk. Interestingly, this is considered to be high risk according to the red temperature zone, but it's low risk here. But it shows up again down here in a sort of much more just temperature-focused, wet bulb temperature-focused approach to mapping future human habitability done by some colleagues for the proceedings of what's called PNAS, or Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And they basically found these areas to be potentially at risk of passing thresholds for human habitability in terms of temperature alone by like 2100. That's where wet bulb temperature surpasses a level where physiologically people can kind of survive. And this was a kind of earlier effort to do something similar, but they combined it with demographic projections. And the idea from I'm both a tennis player and a geographer, so I think about the sweet spot for human habitability, and I think about how that could grow or contract depending on temperature. So some areas may grow in habitability. If you get warmer temperatures in the Arctic, for instance, maybe more people may be able to make a living there. The soils are really bad, though, so you have to think about drainage and soils and things like that. But other areas may contract. And there's been this historic pattern of where people have settled, and it's within a remarkably limited band of temperature and precipitation ranges. So people tend to settle in certain areas. But it's not enough just to look at the physical constraints or the physical, but also the socioeconomic. So this is a map. If you go back to our booth, you can pick up a nice lens cleaner that has this map printed on it. And what you'll see is that areas that are in lighter colors are what we consider to be more deprived, and areas that are in darker bluish colors are considered to be more well-off or relatively less deprived. And so it's a combination, really, of the physical and the socioeconomic that drive a lot of human responses and condition whether people will be able to move or not. If you're super poor and you're living in the Sahel, for instance, moving may not be an option. So this diagram is an attempt to sort of summarize what I've just talked about, where you have environmental hazards on the one hand that intersect with the social vulnerability on the other. And the social vulnerability are things like your age. It could be conditioned by things like your age, if you're handicapped or not, if you have a certain education level, if you have a certain income, things of that sort. And that generates risk. But whether risk generates mobility, there's some additional factors that we might want to consider. So mobility is a term of preference, or the term of art that people are talking about, because it covers things like displacement, resettlement, planned relocation, and what most people think of when they think of migration is permanent migration, but also temporary forms of migration where it's more circular. People do it seasonally in certain parts of the world during the dry season, for instance. But whether people move or not also is a function of things like governmental responses and institutional capacity. past experience. Do people actually, have they had a history of migrating or not? Availability of other types of responses. Can you adapt in place? Can you get better agriculture? Can you shift the times of day? Already in some parts of the world, people are actually starting their agricultural day, or if they're farmers, they're starting much earlier and knocking off earlier because it's too hot in the middle of the day. And then things like perceptions play a major role, and we'll see more about that in a little bit. And these feedback, and so mobility itself can be if a lot of young people and economically active and educated people leave a place, that can actually have an effect on the social vulnerability of the place where they left from. So this is kind of a wordy slide. I apologize for it, but it basically gets it to sort of the evidence base. Where do we actually get evidence from? So people have looked. I've worked with some colleagues at Princeton and talked with them about their pre-industrialized assessment of pre-industrialized societies. Things like tree rings and paleoclimate reconstructions that you've seen in some of the exhibits around here. People have used those to reconstruct past climates and then assess whether they may have played some role in migration in places like the Western Roman Empire towards the end of in a period of I think more intense cold waves. Maya with drought, etc. Then in more recent years, people have looked at analog events such as the Dust Bowl or the Sahelian droughts. I was actually in Peace Corps in the mid-'80s, and I saw a lot of dead animals, and I was in a country called Mauritania, which is in the Sahel, so the Sahel band was particularly affected by drought in this period, and a lot of people had to give up pastoralism, and some people gave up farming and moved to the cities and lived outside of towns like Nouakchott in Mauritania or Bamako in Mali. Careful statistical analyses make up the bulk of the studies that have been out there, and this is where you take census data or other data, survey data, and you basically look at, or large-scale survey data, and you look at all the factors that might cause people to move from one place to another, and you add climate in, and you look at the marginal effect that climate may have had, like temperature changes or precipitation changes or increased warm spells or dry spells or whatever that may have had some effect on people's decision to move. And a lot of these studies have found significant, statistically significant impacts of climate-related events on movements. Then there's more anthropological approaches, which is going to the field, talking to people, understanding their own understanding of why people are moving. And then finally, there's more work on displacement from extreme events. I borrow some slides here because they're very good at summarizing some of the high-level findings from a number of studies. They looked at over almost 300 studies to understand what some of the consensus is around this issue. So they had very nice pictograms, so I think it's a little easier to follow than some of the some other approaches. But this one looks at climate shock events, and the evidence shows very clearly that people are displaced short-term from shock events. So if you get a flood, people move out. If there's a fire in the Pacific Northwest, people will move out of those areas immediately. The question is, do they return or do they not? We saw in Katrina, in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, that quite a number of people actually, once they left and were displaced from New Orleans, they stayed in places like Atlanta and Houston. They determined they settled or they had jobs or whatever, and they found that they could, make a nice life for themselves somewhere else. But there's also a question, some people can't move, like after multiple droughts, because they've sold off all their livestock, or their house has been destroyed by something like flood or something like that. And so there are elements in which people's ability to move is also constrained by multiple disasters. So the evidence kind of points in two different directions in this case. In terms of long-term, like sea level rise, things like long-term secular changes in temperature and precipitation, we have a lot less evidence, partly because our timeline is not very long. We don't, other than those kind of analog events from the 1930s and the 1970s and things, we don't have a lot of evidence to show what people do and what people will do in the future in terms of sea level rise, gradual coastal erosion, et cetera. But partly the evidence, is constrained because we also know that the impacts are going to get more severe in the future, so we have questions about what will happen as those secular changes start taking hold. Adaptive responsive to climate change can also displace people. I've looked at this a bit, and where you put up seawalls, you displace flooding from one place to another place. You actually have to put up massive infrastructure that causes, like canals. In China, they built a massive south to north water transfer scheme, which has displaced millions of people because there were people living in those areas, and they had to basically move them out of the way in order to create this conduit of water from the more humid south to the more arid north. So these are examples. Green technology could result in people being either attracted to new jobs in certain areas or pushed out for various reasons because of the land, the use of the land for that purpose. One thing that I think is really important is that we all think of ourselves as objective, rational human beings who make all of our decisions on the facts. But the truth is that perceptions play an incredibly important role in all of our individual decision making every day. So if we perceive that things are going to get better or worse in where we're living, we may make those judgments. One problem I see right now is that there's a lot of narratives about gloom and doom and the way climate change will impact people in the future. And in places like Africa, a colleague of mine wrote, a paper called The Climate of Anxiety, because he considered in West Africa that these narratives that development and other NGOs were kind of promoting were sort of giving a pessimistic view of the prospects for agriculture, sustainability in those regions. So it may be one more factor that's tipping the scales for people to consider whether to stay or to go. And lastly, we're going to get into the numbers a little bit because I'm more of a numbers person in some ways in the types of work that I do, using maps and geospatial information to estimate where people have moved from and to project where they go to. So we're going to talk about this. But this particular review basically, and I agree with them, said they took a low view of these projections and said we really don't know what the numbers are going to be in the future. So let me turn to the research that I've been involved with at Season. We actually have a group of people that I lead in this kind of little area of climate mobility, and we'll be describing some of that work. This is early work I was involved with, which was more of a policy-oriented report, where they took a lot of field work from all over the world, and they wanted maps to sort of illustrate some of the issues. So one example was in the Mekong Delta. You can see that if you get a 2-meter sea level rise, which is the dark or the light blue, sorry, my eyesight's not so good. So 2 meters would be the lighter shades here. Darker would be 1 meter. You're going to get a lot of the rice basket of Asia is going to be underwater. And so what might happen in those contexts? And so they coupled it with field research. Currently, right now, what's happening in the fringe, anyway, of the Mekong is they're converting a lot of that to shrimp aquaculture, because shrimp aquaculture is one way that the land can still be used even when it becomes increasingly saline. This is Central America and Mexico, and basically we looked at projections of rainfall runoff, which is sort of the sum of both temperature and precipitation, and some could be considered in that way, and they had a couple field studies that they conducted research in that complemented this work. And things like cyclones also play a major role in displacement and potentially eventually onward migration. So that was early work. In about 2010 or so, we were approached by the UK Foresight Office. They produced what I consider still to be the benchmark report on the issue of migration and climate change in 2011 or 12. And they asked us if we could estimate the amounts of net migration for every 1 kilometer grid cell in the world, and do it past and up to 2010. And so we did that, and the areas in blue show areas that basically represent net out-migration, or more people leaving than coming in. And areas in red show areas where you'll see net in-migration. Once you get this gridded data set, you can do some pretty cool stuff. But one thing you can also do is just look at the time series. So this is 2080 to 2090. You see the kind of hollowing out of rural central China, a lot of people moving, going to the coastal zone, the coastal cities, some hollowing out in southern India, even greater hollowing out in the 90s in these areas. Hollowing out is a little dramatic, but it's basically people leaving, more people leaving than staying or coming in, I should say. And so at the end of this, what we could do is use different boundary layers to say how many people are going in this area and how many people are, like, is it net out or net in? And we did that for drylands, and the result was by decade here for each continent, you can see that pretty much every region in the world, especially Asia, some of those blue areas you saw earlier, which are actually many of them very relatively more arid, much of Africa, places that are semi-arid, much of India, a lot of people are leaving these areas and moving elsewhere out of these ecosystems. But net migration is positive in one region only across all decades, which is North America, the US. So a lot of people, you may recall during this period, were moving from the US Northeast or other parts and going to the American Southwest, to Arizona, New Mexico, et cetera, Southern California. Mountain ecosystems, you see the same pattern globally. Most regions see negative net migration out of that mountain ecosystems. But once again, North America stands out as a place where people are moving in for amenities. They're moving to places like Colorado, the High Rockies. And then finally, coastal ecosystems across the board. And we say, why are people moving like lemmings towards the coast and towards more risk, where sea level rise and coastal hazards like hurricanes are more intense? Well, that's a big question, and it's largely driven by economics. People perceive greater opportunities in those coastal towns and cities. So that was the past. Then we were asked by the World Bank if we could project into the future and understand where migration might occur as a result of climate impacts. So our baseline was what's called a population gravity model. And the population gravity model basically looks at where people are in relation to urban areas. And each pixel, so this is a representation of population with red areas being urban and blue areas being rural. Each pixel gets in each time step, as you calculate or you project forward, gets a population potential, which results in more people being attracted or fewer people being attracted into that pixel, depending on its characteristics. So what you see is after one time step, more people move into urban areas. This basically replicates a pattern we've seen throughout much of the last century, which is people are moving from more rural areas to urban areas. And you can mathematically essentially model that process. What the model does is it looks at mass and distance. So, you know, if you're closer to this urban area, you're more likely to move towards this large urban area. If you're closer to this one, you might be more likely to move here, or the pull might be even greater to this one. But basically, agglomeration or cities act as sort of a proxy for all the things that make urban areas really attractive, like education, jobs, et cetera. And what we wanted to see is whether environmental factors might affect the future attractiveness of certain areas in the world. So we did that, again, dividing the world up into these grid cells. A very simple way of looking at this is these are 15-kilometer grid cells. We consider if anyone moves across a 15-kilometer space, that represents a sort of permanent form of migration. And we do one projection with only development scenarios, so we already are assuming a certain amount of economic development and progress and other things in an area, maybe certain assumptions about urbanization rates and things like that. But then we do another model that adds in the climate impacts. And when we add in the climate impacts, we might see more people moving in this fictitious island nation of 45 by 45 kilometers from the northwest to the southeast. So then you can difference that and basically say that climate is attributable, or that climate migration is happening in these areas where more people are being drawn in, and climate outmigration is occurring in these blue areas where the climate impacts are kind of repelling people from those areas. You can then do this for every country in the world, which we have done mostly, every low-income country that is, for the World Bank work. And you basically get a sort of map. This is Senegal and West Africa, where red areas show potential climate migration inward to 2050, the year 2050, and blue areas show migration out. And if you just summarize those by summing up all the positive grid cells, you get, by scenario, different levels of what we call climate mobility. So because the positive grid cells and the negative grid cells essentially sum to 0, if you just take the positive ones, you get these numbers of roughly 0.75 million under a kind of lower emission scenario, or I should say moderately high emission scenario, and fast economic development. Low economic development results in even more climate migrants, and low economic development with low emissions results in slightly lower than this and more uncertainty for various reasons, and then an optimistic scenario with roughly only 0.6 million migrants by 2050. So this is cumulative migration over time. Here are the geophysical or climate inputs that we use. It's from the international or intersectoral model intercomparison project. So it's an international project that compares crop and water and forest and ecosystem models. And blue areas represent increases in water availability in these maps. Red areas compared to baseline. Red areas represent decreases in water availability, sometimes up to 90% declines in water availability. And it all depends on what climate scenario you use and which of the impact models you choose to use. So parts of, if it's to be believed, the models suggest that parts of South Asia will actually get wetter over time. And again, we have to be clear that there's fairly high uncertainty in a lot of these models, and we do that in the text. I'm just giving you the sort of take-home message. So these are some of the crop model inputs that we use for modeling future attractiveness of grid cells. And what you see here is sort of headline numbers. If you've seen in the media reports of 216 million potential migrants by the year 2050, that's from our work. And basically what I worry about is they never cite the low-end bar. So the 48 million, which is really pretty small when you consider a world of 10 billion plus people by 2050. 48 million is not a lot of people, but they tend to focus on the higher upper bound to get people's attention. This gives you a sense of the range and uncertainty around each of the scenarios, where we have a pessimistic scenario with high emissions and low development outcomes on the one hand, and we have a more climate-friendly scenario on the other hand. Africa has very high sensitivity from climate perspective, partly because of the socioeconomic and deprivation measures that I showed you earlier. We can then map these out by country or region, and this is North Africa with kind of movement out of rural areas towards urban areas in many places. Eastern Africa with a lot of movement to highland areas. And the same trend was found in Mexico and Central America, where certain highland areas were actually considered to be more climate friendly in the future and therefore attractive to migration. We did the same for this report called Africa Shifts, which is focused only on Africa with another group. And we use a slightly different model with slightly different inputs. You can go to this website here and actually look at the results. It's actually won a Webby Award for web design. We didn't produce it ourselves, and a web company did so, but they did a very nice job with the data. These are some other research findings. We've been looking at migration in West Africa quite a bit, and this is some work that we've done with data that actually collects from something like how many flow monitoring points? 47 flow monitoring points throughout West Africa, where they actually interview people periodically, and they had 200,000 interviews. Well, that's an awful lot of data, and they were just sitting at IOM, the International Organization for Migration. Nobody was really using them. So we asked to access the data, and we've been able to associate them with things like changes in crop prices, crop price shocks, temperature, precipitation change, and other factors to look at what's driving people to move from certain areas of West Africa. Turns out a lot of the research suggests that in this region, in West Africa, people are actually not moving so much because of climate, but they're just not happy with future prospects in their countries, and they're worried about governance. They don't have access to jobs, and so there's an increasing migration, which brings me to this slide, which talks about a comparative project that's funded by DoD under what's called the Minerva program. In this project, we're looking at a comparison between West Africa and Central America migration from the south to the north into the respective developed countries. And you see the trends over time. We've seen massive peaks in numbers of people apprehended at the US-Mexican border. This only ends in like 2022, so we don't quite have the data for most recent, this last summer. But you can see spikes before COVID, then a dip, and then an increase again. And then we have West Africans apprehended at the EU border here with a big peak around 2016-17, but a pretty steady state number of migrants trying to get north and being apprehended. This does not account, of course, for everyone because there's some people who get through without being apprehended, so we have to recognize the limitations of the data. But why? We're asking why have these increases occurred? What's going on and what are the underlying economic and demographic factors? What's going on with technology? A lot of migrants now are assisted by smartphones and other tools. Okay, so I'm going to have to wrap up in a minute. My wife has just signaled me. But these are things that we're looking at, and we're really interested in understanding what's underlying. This is just some high-level survey findings, and what you find is that basically environmental stressors. This is what migrants themselves say when they're asked why they're moving in these two regions, and it's almost entirely economic. You see slightly higher issues around violence and insecurity in Central America. Violence, insecurity, and conflict falls lower among West Africans. But family reasons and questions of economic security really predominate. These environmental stressors are generally low down, and there could be reasons, could be that some of those environmental stressors aren't really perceived, but they're actually affecting things like crops and income in ways that are more indirect. We've looked at urbanization levels and changes in urbanization in different regions and the impacts of things like sea level rise that might affect future urbanization scenarios. A new project looks at the Caribbean region, and we're going to be focusing very heavily on that over the next year to kind of model future migration from there. Some of you may want to know what's going to happen in the New York area. There's a lot of impacts that are climate driven in different parts of the country, but you see the Northeast, other than like sea level rise, you know, it tends to be kind of benign, you know, maybe a little bit of drought here and there, but not too bad, right? Certainly one of the areas that might be spared the highest temperatures in the US in the future. So what might happen in the US in terms of future migration? Here's some more headlines if you want analogous headlines for the US. And I've interacted with a number of these journalists, including Abram Lusgarten, you know, in his work. I respect his journalistic work tremendously. But you know, these are real questions. Are people going to move from certain areas because of increased heat, drought? We've seen the recent article about drying up of aquifers in certain regions. We've seen the headlines about the Mississippi drying up. There's really relatively little in terms of projections in the US of what might happen. This is purely sea level rise related. And one of the points this article is making is that the feedback effects. So when you leave a certain area like South Florida, it's going to leave more vulnerable, higher risk populations like the elderly behind if someone is economically active and they move inland. So that may have a certain self-fulfilling feedback loop where those become less desirable areas in the future. So these are questions that we're asking. We host every 2 years a managed retreat conference here at Columbia University where we look at these issues both in the US and internationally. One big issue is the amount of home in the low elevation coastal zone close to the coast. The value of these homes is huge. If insurance markets start to dry up, what's going to happen to all that those stranded assets in essence? If people can't get an insurance to get a mortgage, they're not going to be able to move in, or they're not going to be able to sell their house to someone else who might want to move into their neighborhood. And so these are real issues that are going to play themselves out in the coming decades. I'm going to skip through this. I'm sorry, it's really important. The only thing I'd say is that what's really important in this space is there's different ways of framing climate migration from a policy response perspective. One is throw up bigger walls, build bigger fences, keep people out. Another is help all those people in their home countries and try to provide them with humanitarian assistance. Another is kind of a yet to be really tried, but to really move to manage migration better and help migrants who want to move. to improve their lot and improve the lot of the people who they leave behind through remittances. But the author of this piece really focuses on a self-determination approach, which is how to make people able to make decisions for themselves and make them better. I'm going to put this up just as backdrop because you've already heard these points, but maybe we could open things up for some questions if anyone has any questions. Yes?
Thank you for the presentation. It suggests, though, that some of the policies aimed at reducing greenhouse gases may in certain areas inhibit economic development, which may have a greater impact, particularly in poor areas. So, and it suggests to me that we need to fine-tune this and avoid sort of broad-based, don't do this, don't put in a coal power plant in a particular area because coal is evil. Do you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, this last week I was at a meeting at the National Academy of Sciences, and we were talking about decarbonization and how, like, there's this massive, you've heard of it, the Inflation Reduction Act, right, which is going to be funneling a lot of money towards clean energy and hopefully greener sources of energy. But one thing that the people who are mostly from Department of Energy were concerned about is, what are the impacts of moving, say, into green energy in certain parts of the country? Let's say you put up massive wind farms in certain areas. A lot of these don't generate jobs, right? You have some maintenance workers at a low level, kind of like keeping things moving and maybe highly technically qualified, but they're not generating the kinds of jobs that we had in the past. So how do we then sort of retool the economies in those areas away from, say, coal to more green forms of energy? And it's a really important question. And then, inevitably some people will say, well, I'm done here. I'm going to move somewhere else where there's more opportunity. So that would be a knock-on effect. I see a hand in the back.
As they were. So in the U.S., people aren't moving as frequently as they were, like, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, right? Like, what's going to give that impetus? I know there's people in other countries moving, but, they seem to be staying in place when there's some dire economics going on.
Yeah, I'd have to look at the data. I'm not convinced that that's actually a correct assessment. Now, people tend to move in different demographic age groups differentially, right? So younger people who are just out of college will move much more readily in the first 10 or 15 years of their lives before they settle down and have a family. And then as you get older, you tend to stay more in place until you might retire somewhere different. I'd have to look at the numbers, to be honest. I couldn't tell you for sure if what you just said is true or not. What's happened also is people have become increasingly freed, at least at a certain income bracket and education bracket, free from the constraint of being near their jobs. They can, move to more places they consider to be more desirable from an amenity perspective. So that's happening increasingly since COVID. So these disruptors, they're like layered upon one another. And I think one of the points I wanted to make here is not just in the US, but everywhere, it's not climate alone. Like, there's a great article out there, like, climate is not destiny, it's not history, it's not going to determine what's going to happen, in our future in a kind of deterministic sense. It's going to interact with many, many complicating factors. In regions of the world where governance systems are breaking down and where gang activity is ripe, like in Central America, which is one of those regions we're looking at, then you have to look at this messy mix of factors, the confluence of factors that is causing people to want to move. And I think in many cases it's about safety. We tend to think of it as a threat, but it's really people seeking safety and safe havens. So I guess there's one more or two hands there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk.
Sure.
I'm impressed with the amount of data.
Mm-hmm.
With all these data that you have, can you come to any conclusions on what percentage of climate migration in like 2050 will be international versus national?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the figure that I had there was actually for purely internal migration. And we try to make that very clear, but it doesn't always come across, say, in the media reports. I think right now, about 3% of the world's population has moved across borders. That's generally according to census figures. So censuses will track whether people are born in their country or are non-native to the country. And the 3% figure has actually remained pretty consistent for the last 20, 30 years. In other words, we haven't seen major changes in that percentage globally of international migrants, of the total world population I'm referring to. But obviously 3% of a growing number of people, because the world population has been growing, means more migrants globally in terms of more international migrants. And my own sense is that we're going to see increases. So even though I try to sort of portray the climate refugee narrative as overly simplified, partly because it's really saying it's climate, and that's the factor, that's the main thing. It really isn't just climate, there's a lot of things. But there are an awful lot of people on the move in this world right now, and people are actually taking extreme risks, like crossing the Darien Gap in Central America, to come up from Venezuela or Colombia, or even as far away as China and Africa. Many people are coming into Colombia and going up through the Darien Gap. So my sense is we're just going to see more of that to some degree, unless something happens to stabilize situations in the home countries.
I have a related question. So what do you see as like media's responsibility in that case? Because from what I understand, the issue is it's a mix of factors. It's not just climate mobility which is happening, but it's made out to be that way.
I think it's partly media's scientists' responsibility to communicate better to the media, which I try to do, and I think that succeeds in some cases and doesn't so much in others. But I think we all also need to just have our good scientific skeptical lenses on as individuals. We all have a certain amount of education. We can self-educate. And so, yeah, the media will, I think, portray some of these things in ways that may not be wholly cleaving to the truth or to the full truth, but I've begun to realize that journalists operate with their own incentive structures as well. So we all have to understand what each person's incentive structure is. I think there was one hand in the back. And
Hi, I was wondering if you have thoughts. I know you said that for long-term migration events like sea level rise, things that we might see coming in 20 years in, for example, small island nations, but a place may be habitable for a few more decades. How do we grapple with both, I guess, public perception, leaders, and the folks who are potential migrants having agency in responding to not just being reactive to when there's a natural disaster, but engaging on, we have 20 years or something before
Sure.
this place is definitely not habitable.
So the group that we've been working with for both the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative and the more recent Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative is one that we're actually partnering with in a knowledge partnership. So that's called the Global Center for Climate Mobility. And one of their initiatives is called the Rising Nations Initiative, which is really focused on small island states. And they're looking at very practical solutions related to, for instance, certain countries in the world have actual populations within them that operate with a certain amount of sovereignty. The US, Canada, Australia, where there are Aboriginal or indigenous populations that have some sovereign claim over their own territory and governance over those territories. And the idea would be, could you find locations in the world where, say, the people of Tuvalu can actually exercise that level of sovereignty, have their own sort of state within a state? it's a very complicated politically and legally, it's a politically and legally challenging solution, but people are looking at that as an option. That doesn't address the long-standing cultural and historical ties that the people of Tuvalu have to their nation, and things like wanting to be close to where their ancestors are buried and things of that sort. So it sort of sidesteps a lot of, well, I won't say it totally sidesteps, but it sort of is trying to take a pragmatic approach because it ultimately may be an existential question for some of these people in terms of where they live. I think Steve's signaling that time is up, so.
Yeah, no, actually, I'm signaling that I want to ask a question.
Oh, please do.
Yeah, I just want to like connect the climate issue to these other issues that you're talking about. Up until very recently, we really haven't seen the impacts of climate change very much, but we have been seeing those impacts. I think everybody who is sensible has been able to see that over the last few years, the climate impacts have been accelerating. And so if that hasn't been having an impact up until now, what's your view about the impact of climate in the future relative to the past? So what I'm trying to say is that up until now, it may well be that climate has not been a big motivator for people to move, but up until now, we really haven't seen the impact of climate change as we have over the past few years. And in my perspective, it appears to be accelerating.
Right, and I think you're right, and that was part of what I was implying on one of the charts where I said the slow onset, longer term changes have maybe not been observed, like we may not have a lot of evidence for those impacts on climate, on migration yet, because it hasn't really reached a point where we are potentially reaching thresholds where the impacts are severe enough that people might consider moving. And I think this is a critical issue, and it's certainly one that we've been, I discuss and think about a lot, is we don't have all the evidence, partly because we've never seen this, because it's unprecedented. It's not happened before. So even the analogs, the historical analogs, are not sufficient for us to be able to fully understand what could happen in the future. So I don't want to leave on a negative or an unhopeful note. There are a lot of people, thoughtful people, thinking about these issues, not only for the small island developing states, but also for generally trying to create a more humane environment. There's a global compact on migration. There's also a global compact on refugees. There are efforts to sort of try to understand migration not as a harmful process, but one that is necessary and actually enriches our society here in the US, as well as potentially providing refuge for people from outside. So I want to leave on that note, and I want to wish, thank you very much. Unless there's, am I jumping the gun? Are we at the time, or is there one more question in the back? We can take one more.
Yeah, you might have covered this. I was delayed getting here, but
sure.
What about the impact on mosquito-borne illnesses? I don't know if you touched on the impacts on healthcare and what that might do to disease vectors being with migration.
Well, there's both the effect that migration has on bringing pathogens, right? We saw that with COVID, how it spread out, very quickly from China to other parts of the world. But there's probably the more significant impact is the way that new pathogens or diseases might gain a foothold or grow in importance in certain parts of the world as a result of climate impacts, and how that might have another effect or another impact on habitability. Apparently, some of the efforts to contain malaria have actually kind of plateaued, and now sort of we're seeing a point where maybe malaria may be in the resurgence in some parts of the world, and that's a major killer globally. So it's a really good point. I've had some conversations and spoken to people at Mailman School of Public Health about this, and there's a whole program on those issues there as well, on essentially the epidemiology of, I think Jeff Shaman, our dean, has also been involved in that very heavily. So anyway, with that, I want to thank you and wish you a good afternoon.